The world is dark. Not the comfortable darkness of a closed room or a familiar bedroom, but the deep, unbroken darkness of a world that has never known artificial light, that has never heard the distant hum of a city, that has never been interrupted by the blue glow of a screen or the orange wash of a street lamp. This is a different kind of dark. It is the darkness of deep time, the darkness that existed long before any human eye opened to witness it, and it holds within it a silence so old and so complete that even the concept of silence feels too modern, a word to contain it. You're here. Somehow, impossibly, you are here. The air that reaches you first is not what you expected. It is warm, faintly humid, carrying a heaviness that coats the back of the throat like the inside of a greenhouse on a midsummer afternoon. There is something botanical in it, the crushed green scent of plants that have no names yet in any human language, mixed with the deep mineral smell of earth that has been wet for a very long time. Beneath that, something older still, something alive and exhaling in the vast forested dark around you, something that breathes in slow cycles in and out, the breathing of an entire landscape at rest. You do not move, you do not need to. The night itself is moving all around you, and all you're asked to do is be still and listen, and let it carry you somewhere quiet and old and very far from everything that is not sleep. There is a sound coming from somewhere not far away, low, resonant. It travels through the earth before it reaches the air, so you feel it in the soles of your feet before you hear it. It rises slowly, a long single tone that bends at the end, almost like a question asked in a language made entirely of vibration. Then it settles, then it comes again. And then, from very far away, an answer, another tone, lower, slower, drawn out across the dark until it dissolves into the sounds of insects and rain and leaves turning in the warm air. You are standing at the edge of the Late Cretaceous night. The year, if you could give it a number, sits somewhere around 75 million years ago. The continent beneath you is not the continent you know. The oceans have drawn different borders here. The mountain ranges are elsewhere. The air holds a fraction more oxygen than the air of your own time, and it gives the world a lushness that feels almost hallucinatory. Every plant slightly larger than it should be, every tree slightly taller, every shadow slightly deeper. And in the dark, in the distance, in the enormous warm night that stretches away in every direction without limit or landmark, the dinosaurs are awake, and they are making sounds, and those sounds are nothing like anything you have been told to expect. The sounds are slower than you imagined, more resonant. They arrive not from a specific direction, but from the general darkness itself, as if the landscape is speaking rather than any individual creature in it. They are sounds that do not demand a response, do not trigger the particular alertness that any sharp or sudden noise would trigger, do not cut through the quiet, but rather deepen it, layer it, give it a weight and a texture that makes the dark feel inhabited in the most reassuring possible way. The dark is not empty, it is full, and what fills it is unhurried and enormous and entirely at peace. Settle in. Whatever is beneath you can hold your weight. The night ahead is a long one, and it goes back further into time than any night you have entered before. We're going somewhere very old together, through the acoustic history of the most remarkable world that has ever existed on the surface of this planet, and when we arrive at the other end of it, you will be where you need to be, in the deep and dreamless country of sleep, carried there by the oldest sounds the earth has ever made. There is one more thing to know before the night begins in earnest, and it is perhaps the most important thing this story will say. Everything you're about to hear, everything this journey through the ancient acoustic world is going to offer you, has been part of the world for much longer than you have. These sounds predate you. They predate your species. They predate the entire evolutionary lineage that produced your species. They have been sounding in various forms since before the first vertebrate crawled out of the ancient seas onto the ancient land, and they will be sounding long after the last living thing that shares your particular evolutionary history has come and gone. You are a brief participant in something much older and much larger than yourself, and the gift of that participation, the gift of being briefly present in the enormous old acoustic world, is the gift of perspective, the perspective that comes from recognizing yourself as a small, warm thing in a very large dark, held by a night that has been holding small, warm things since long before small, warm things were warm, or small, or things in any sense you would recognize. This. For most of your life, if you ever imagine the sound of a dinosaur, you imagine the same sound. Everyone does. It arrives fully formed, ready-made, borrowed from a film or a childhood picture book, and it is always a roar. Enormous, chest-deep. A sound that compresses the air and shakes the leaves and announces without any ambiguity at all that something vast and dangerous and ancient is very nearby. The roar is so deeply embedded in the popular imagination that it has almost ceased to be a question. We know what dinosaurs sounded like. Everyone knows. They roared. But the truth, as it almost always is more interesting than that, and considerably stranger. And when you sit quietly with it at the end of a long day and let it settle over you like a warm and ancient blanket, considerably more beautiful. You find yourself here, in this story, at the threshold of something that science is only now beginning to understand. The question of what dinosaurs actually sounded like at night is not a simple one. It reaches into evolutionary biology and paleontology and the deep history of how sound itself moves through living bodies. It touches on the behaviour of modern birds and the physiology of crocodilians and the chemistry of the air in the Mesozoic era. It asks us to reimagine creatures we thought we knew and to find, inside those reimaginings, something genuinely surprising. Something that might, in its strangeness, be more calming than the familiar roar ever was. Because what the evidence suggests, what the careful work of researchers across several decades now points toward, is a prehistoric night that was not loud and violent and fearsome, but was instead deeply, complexly, endlessly musical. A night full of low vibrations and infrasonic pulses and resonant chamber calls and the long, slow breathing of enormous bodies at rest. A night that was, in ways we are only beginning to understand, not so different from the kind of night that helps a body find sleep. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, and now let yourself settle a little deeper into wherever you are. Let the muscles in your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, because the night that we are walking into together is a very old one, and it is patient and it has more than enough time for both of us. We begin not with thunder, but with quiet. We begin in the place that researchers have come to call the deep acoustic record of deep time, the layered fossil evidence of how living things communicated in a world before any human was alive to listen. We begin by asking a simple question, and then following it down through 75 million years of dark to find the answer. The question is this: in the vast warm nights of the Mesozoic world, what did it actually sound like to be alive? Come, let us find out together. The sounds we are going to encounter in this story are not the sounds of the cinema. They are not the sounds of Hollywood's Mesozoic, not the carefully engineered roars and shrieks of films that were designed, above all else, to produce a specific emotional response in a specific kind of audience. The sounds in this story are the sounds of the actual prehistoric world, reconstructed as carefully and as honestly as the available science allows, which means that they are, in some ways, more surprising than anything the cinema has offered, and in some ways more beautiful, and in ways that this story will try to demonstrate, more useful to you right now, in this particular night, than anything a cinema has ever produced. Because the actual sounds of the actual prehistoric world were not sounds that produced excitement and alarm in those who received them. They were sounds that produced something closer to the opposite. They were sounds that said, in the most fundamental acoustic grammar available to the living body, the world is large and old and proceeding without incident, and you, small warm creature in the dark, can rest. There is a particular kind of belief that sits so comfortably inside the mind that it has never needed to announce itself as a belief at all. It arrived before memory, before reasoning, and it has simply been there ever since, the way the colour of the sky is there, unquestioned and obvious and absolutely certain. The roar of the dinosaur is one of those beliefs. It was handed to us before we were old enough to ask where it came from. It arrived with the plastic toys and the illustrated books, and then, with extraordinary force, with the cinema, and it lodged itself so deeply that even people who know better sometimes catch themselves expecting it, bracing for it, almost disappointed when the world around them fails to produce it. Settle into wherever you are right now. Let your body grow a little heavier against whatever is beneath you. because this story is going to take you somewhere worth going, and the journey is gentle, and there is no need to hold yourself up along the way. You can release that. You can let the night carry you. But here is the thing that keeps paleontologists awake at nights, and it is a thing worth understanding quietly and completely before we go any further into this particular story. Dinosaurs, all of them, every species across the entire enormous span of the Mesozoic era, left behind not a single preserved sound. There is no fossilized audio. There is no ancient recording. There are bones which tell us about size and structure and the way weight was distributed across a skeleton. There are footprints which tell us about movement and behavior and the social patterns of animals that moved in groups. There are trace fossils and soft tissue impressions and the occasional miraculous preservation of skin texture or feather structure. But there is no preserved voice. The sounds that filled the Cretaceous air, the Jurassic night, the Triassic dawn, those sounds are simply gone, dissolved into a silence as complete and as final as the silence of the deep-sea floor. Think about that for a moment. Think about the extraordinary completeness of that absence. Every sound that was ever made in the Mesozoic world, every call that crossed a floodplain, every vibration that passed through the shallow warm waters of an inland sea, every low resonance that settled into the root systems of trees that no longer exist, every acoustic event that happened across 180 million years of life on this planet, all of that is gone. Not recorded, not encoded anywhere that we can read, not compressed into stone or amber or ice. Simply gone, the way that heat goes when it dissipates, the way that light goes when the source is extinguished. It existed, fully and completely, and then it ceased to exist, and it left nothing behind except our questions. What this means, in practical terms, is that every single dinosaur sound in every single film and television production and museum exhibit and theme park attraction is an invention. It is always an invention. Even the most carefully researched, scientifically informed reconstructions are, at their core, educated guesses made by human beings who are trying to fill an absence with something plausible. And the roar, the famous roar, the one that colonized the imagination of every child who has ever held a toy Tyrannosaurus and opened its jaws, that roar is not even a particularly educated guess. It is largely a borrowing. It is what large mammals sound like, scaled up and distorted and processed and layered. Walrus calls and lion growls and the stretched bellowing of elephants combined and altered through film audio technology and delivered to ears that were already primed to find it satisfying. The people who create these sounds are talented, and the sounds they produce are dramatic, and they do exactly what they are intended to do, which is to make large prehistoric animals feel dangerous and immediate and viscerally real to audiences sitting in darkened cinemas or in the warm light of living rooms. They serve their purpose completely. But their purpose is not scientific accuracy. Their purpose is feeling, and the feeling they are designed to produce is something between awe and fear, the particular electric thrill of being in proximity to something that could, in a world slightly different from our own, kill you without much difficulty. That thrill is real. That thrill is even, in its way, honest about something. But it is not the sound of the Cretaceous night. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, in the way that one sits with any piece of information that requires the gentle reorganization of something that felt solid. The roar is not what dinosaurs sounded like. It cannot be, because dinosaurs were not large mammals. They were something else entirely, something that branched off the tree of life at a different point, and developed differently and lived differently, and almost certainly communicated differently. The question of what they actually sounded like requires us to think about what kind of thing a dinosaur actually was, and to follow the evidence from what we know rather than from what we have always assumed. And it requires us to do something that is actually quite beautiful, which is to think about the deepest relatives of the dinosaur lineage, to look at what survived them and what walked alongside them, and to use those living witnesses to triangulate backward across the 66 million years of silence to something resembling the truth. This is the work of comparative biology, and it is patient work, and it is exactly the kind of work that repays patience with something extraordinary. The evidence, when you follow it carefully, leads you to two living groups of animals that are the closest relatives of the non-avian dinosaurs. On one side, there are the birds, which are not merely similar to dinosaurs in certain ways, but are, in the most precise biological sense, a lineage of theropod dinosaurs that survived the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous and continued forward into our own time. Every bird you have ever seen or heard is a dinosaur. The sparrow outside your window in the morning is a dinosaur. The crow that watches from the fence post is a dinosaur. The albatross gliding on ocean thermals for years without touching land is a dinosaur. When you hear a bird sing at dawn, you are hearing a dinosaur, and that is not a metaphor or a loose analogy. It is a precise biological fact. On the other side, there are the crocodilians, those ancient and patient reptiles that have barely changed since the Mesozoic era, and whose lineage runs alongside the dinosaur lineage on the Great Tree of Life, sharing a common ancestor that lived in the Triassic period before the two groups diverged. Crocodiles and alligators and gharials, sitting in their rivers and swamps, watching through half-closed eyes, communicating in low rumbles and infrasonic vibrations that travel through both water and earth. Those creatures carry within their biology something of the acoustic range of the ancient world, and when an alligator produces its deep bellowing call at the edge of a swamp in the early morning, it is producing something that its ancestor produced in the morning of the Mesozoic world. Between these two groups, between the birds and the crocodilians, researchers have begun to reconstruct something. Not a perfect picture, not a definitive answer, but an outline, a set of probabilities, a sense of what was more likely and what was less likely in the acoustic world of the prehistoric night. And what emerges from that reconstruction is, for those of us listening in the dark at the end of a long day, something genuinely worth hearing, something that is more interesting and more calming than the roar that Hollywood gave us. The first and perhaps most important thing that emerges is this. Most dinosaurs, particularly the large non-avian dinosaurs, probably did not vocalize in the way that mammals do. They did not have a larynx, the vocal structure that produces mammalian calls, including the roar. What they had, or what many of them likely had, was a different structure entirely, one whose closest living analogue exists not in the throat of a lion or a bear, but in the syrinx of a bird, or possibly in the resonating chambers of a crocodilian. These structures do not produce roars, they produce something else, something lower in many cases, something more resonant, something that moves through the body and through the earth as much as it moves through the air. There is a bird alive today in New Zealand, a flightless one, called the kiwi, and the kiwi is nocturnal and produces calls that travel surprising distances through dense forest at night. The kiwi's call is not gentle, but it demonstrates the carrying power of sounds produced by specialized respiratory anatomy, rather than by simple open-mouthed shouting. There is also the bittern, a wading bird found across many parts of the world, whose call is described consistently as a deep boom, a sound produced by inflating the esophagus and pushing air through it in slow pulses that resonate through the enlarged vocal chamber. The bittern's boom can be heard from several kilometers away. It carries through fog and forest and the thick wet air of marshlands. It is a sound that arrives at the listener from a direction that is difficult to pinpoint, because it travels at a frequency close to the resonant frequency of the surrounding environment, and so it surrounds rather than pierces, encompasses rather than punctures, arrives not as an intrusion into the silence but as a deepening of it. These are the sounds, the researchers suggest, that are perhaps closer to what a large dinosaur produced in the night. Not a roar that announces itself with violence and demands an immediate response from every nervous system within earshot. Something deeper. Something that moves through the ground as well as through the air. Something that arrives not as an intrusion but as a presence, a vibration that you feel before you hear it, that settles into the body rather than startling it awake, that carries information without carrying alarm. Let yourself receive that image for a moment. A great animal on a dark plain 75 million years ago, breathing slowly in the warm night air. Around it the sounds of the world as it was then. Insects unlike any insects that exist today, singing in frequencies we can only guess at. Water moving through channels that will eventually become dry stone in landscapes that no longer look like anything on Earth. The wind through vegetation that grew in patterns shaped by a climate warmer and wetter than anything in the modern world. And beneath all of that, below the insect chorus and the water sounds and the wind through the ancient trees, a low, sustained, unhurried vibration from the great animal itself, a sound so low it is felt in the sternum as much as heard by the ears, a sound that says, in the language of frequencies rather than words, I am here, the night is mine, everything is proceeding as it should. The night around you carries this kind of sound now, in the careful reconstruction of this story. It is not frightening. It is, when you let yourself settle into it, something closer to the deep note of a very large instrument, a sound that the world itself seems to be playing slowly and without hurry, a sound that has been playing since long before any creature learned to be afraid of the dark. The roar was never the right sound. The roar belongs to a different kind of animal and a different kind of night. The right sound for a Cretaceous night is a low, patient resonance, a sustained note in the bottom register of the world's orchestra, dissolving slowly into the warm, dark air, making room for whatever will come next in the enormous, layered, impossibly old music of the prehistoric night. And that sound, the actual sound of the actual prehistoric world, turns out to be not a sound that raises the pulse and sharpens the attention and calls the nervous system to alertness. It is a sound that does the opposite, a sound that carries in its very frequencies the information that the world is proceeding as it should, that the large things in the dark are not alarmed, that the night is what it is supposed to be. It is, in the most literal physical sense, a sound that helps you sleep. The ancient night knew what it was doing when it made these sounds, and now, in the particular quiet of wherever you are, that ancient knowledge is available to you, waiting in the low end of the register, patient as the world itself. There is something else worth noting before we move forward, and it is this. The silence between the sounds matters as much as the sounds themselves. In the prehistoric night, as in every night before and since, the silences were as structured and as meaningful as the calls. An animal that stopped calling was communicating something. A forest that went quiet was saying something. The absence of sound was itself a kind of language, and the prehistoric world was fluent in it. In the story we are about to enter together, you will find yourself moving through both the sounds and the silences of a world unimaginably old, and in both of those registers, in the vibrations and in the spaces between them, there is rest available. There is something that invites the body to slow down and the mind to soften, and the whole complicated architecture of wakefulness to begin, very gently to dissolve. The silence between the sounds matters as much as the sounds themselves. In the prehistoric night, as in every night before and since, the silences were as structured and as meaningful as the calls. An animal that stopped calling was communicating something. A forest that went quiet was saying something. The absence of sound was itself a kind of language, and the prehistoric world was fluent in it. We lose something when we think of the prehistoric night only in terms of its sounds, because we miss the grammar of the silences, the way the pauses between vocalizations carried information about safety and alertness, and the collective state of the landscape. A forest that has gone completely silent is a forest that has perceived a threat. A forest that is making its ordinary ambient sounds is a forest that has assessed the situation and found nothing requiring action. You're in the second kind of forest tonight. There is also something worth noting about the relationship between frequency and distance in the acoustic world of the large dinosaurs. Low-frequency sounds travel further than high-frequency sounds in the same medium. The physics of sound propagation are straightforward on this point. The longer the wavelength, the less efficiently the medium absorbs the sound, and the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. This means that the very low-frequency calls of the large dinosaurs were not just produced at a different pitch from the roar that popular culture has given them. They were also produced with a specific and practical purpose related to their acoustic properties. A 30 Hz call travels further than a 300 Hz call through the same forest. A vibration that travels through the ground does not have to compete with the absorption of air at all. The large dinosaurs were not simply using the frequencies that happened to emerge from their anatomy. They were using the frequencies that worked best for the ecological communication they needed to maintain, and those frequencies happened to be exactly the frequencies that the human nervous system finds most calming, most grounding, most conducive to the state of restful presence that precedes sleep. One more thing worth considering before the night takes us further into the prehistoric world. The concept of the roar carries with it an implicit claim about the emotional lives of the animals that produced it, a claim that those animals were primarily dramatic, primarily in states of heightened arousal, primarily engaged with the world in terms of threat and display and the projection of power. But the fossil record, read carefully, tells a different story. The trace fossils of Hadrosaur nest sites show animals that return to the same nesting grounds season after season, that arranged their nests in social clusters rather than in isolated positions, that invested in the care of their eggs and their hatchlings in ways that required sustained behavioural complexity over extended periods of time. These are not the behaviours of animals that exist only in the heightened states of violence and display that the raw implies. These are the behaviours of animals with complex social lives, with sustained relationships, with the kind of temporal depth of experience that only long-term social living can produce. The sounds of those animals would have reflected that complexity, would have been as varied and as contextually rich as the social lives that produced them. Before sound can exist, there must be a structure to produce it. The voice, in any animal, is not a simple thing. It is the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure, shaped by the need to communicate across distance, to attract mates and warn rivals and call to offspring and signal danger, shaped also by the specific architecture of the body that carries it, the size of the chest cavity, the length and flexibility of the neck, the density of the skull, the particular way that air moves through a particular arrangement of tissue and bone. The voice is a physical thing as much as it is a communicative one. It is the body's own instrument, grown from the inside out, tuned over evolutionary time to the requirements of the specific world in which it needs to function. In mammals, that instrument is centered in the larynx, a cartilaginous structure in the upper throat that houses the vocal cords, two folds of tissue that vibrate as air is pushed past them from the lungs. The tension and thickness of these folds determines the pitch of the resulting sound. The volume of air pushed past them determines the loudness, the shape of the mouth, the position of the tongue, the resonant spaces of the nasal cavity. All of these shape the sound into something recognizable as speech or roar or bark or howl, or the particular frequency signature of one individual animal among many. It is a highly versatile system, capable of producing an extraordinary range of sounds, with relatively minor adjustments of the same basic components. It is also, in the long history of vertebrate life on Earth, a relatively recent development, an evolutionary novelty that belongs to the mammalian lineage specifically rather than to any deeper or more ancient architectural tradition. Dinosaurs, as reptiles and the ancestors of birds, took a different evolutionary path. The structure that produces sound in birds is not the larynx but the syrinx, a unique organ found at the junction of the trachea and bronchi, much further down in the body than the larynx, sitting at the fork where the airway divides to serve the two lungs. This location, deep in the chest rather than high in the throat, gives the syrinx access to a different range of resonating cavities and a different relationship to the air moving through the respiratory system. The syrinx is remarkable for several reasons, not least of which is that in many bird species it can produce two different sounds simultaneously, one from each bronchus, which is why many birds can produce the extraordinarily complex songs that they do, weaving their own counterpoint, layering their own harmony with their own melody, two voices from one body creating something that neither voice alone could produce. The question of whether non-avian dinosaurs had a syrinx has been the subject of careful and sometimes contentious research in the field of dinosaur paleobiology. Soft tissue structures do not fossilize easily under most conditions. The syrinx, being made primarily of cartilage and soft tissue rather than bone, leaves almost no direct trace in the fossil record under ordinary circumstances. For a long time, the absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence, and many researchers assumed that the non-avian dinosaurs communicated through simpler means, or perhaps barely vocalized at all. But the absence of a fossil syrinx does not mean the absence of a syrinx in life. It means only that the conditions for its preservation were almost never met, which is a very different claim. In 2016, a team of researchers announced the discovery of a fossilized syrinx from a small bird-like dinosaur called Vegavisiae, preserved in rock from the end of the Cretaceous period of Antarctica. This was the first direct fossil evidence of a syrinx in any dinosaur or bird ancestor, and it was significant for several reasons. The structure showed that the syrinx had already evolved in the avian lineage by the latest Cretaceous, confirming that the capacity for complex syrinx-based vocalization was present in the dinosaur lineage before the end Cretaceous extinction. It also suggested, by the structure of the fossil, that the animal had been capable of producing calls similar to the honking or quacking of modern waterfowl, a sound considerably more complex than the simple open-mouthed calls that might have been expected from the ancient relatives of birds. What we do have, beyond this single exceptional fossil, is something perhaps more useful. We have the skulls, and in those skulls, particularly in the skulls of the large hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that were among the most common large herbivores of the late Cretaceous, there are structures of astonishing complexity that could have served no purpose other than acoustic amplification. The Hadrosaur Parasaurolophus, which you may have seen illustrated in books or on screen, carried a hollow crest extending backward from its skull that was, in fully grown individuals, nearly 2 meters long. Inside this crest, the nasal passages were extended and coiled, looping back on themselves in an elaborate spiral, before eventually connecting to the nostrils and the back of the throat. It is one of the most extraordinary cranial structures in the entire fossil record, and for a long time paleontologists were genuinely uncertain what it was for. Various hypotheses were proposed, some more imaginative than others: a snorkel for feeding underwater, a salt gland, a display structure pure and simple, an organ for enhanced chemosensory detection of food or predators. But when researchers modelled the acoustic properties of the crest using CT scanning and computer simulation, what they found was that those internal passages functioned as a resonating chamber, operating on the same physical principles as a trombone. Air pushed through the crest resonated at a specific frequency determined by the length and diameter of the tubes, producing a low, sustained tone that would have been audible over very large distances. Different crest sizes and shapes among individuals and species would have produced different notes. A young animal's smaller crest would have produced a higher note. An adult male's longer crest would have produced a lower one. A herd of Parasaurolophus, moving through the late Cretaceous forests in the early evening, calling to one another across the darkening landscape, would have produced a sound something like a very ancient orchestra warming up, each instrument tuned differently, each voice distinct, the whole blending into a rich and resonant chord that carried for kilometers through the humid, late Cretaceous air. The acoustic modelling work on Parasaurolophus produced an estimate for the fundamental frequency of its call, somewhere around 30 to 40 Hz, depending on the individual, putting it at the very bottom of the human hearing range and into the lower middle register of very large musical instruments. This is the frequency range that, in the modern world, is produced by the lowest notes of an organ pipe, or a contrabassoon, or the deep chest notes of a very large drum. It is the frequency range that the body experiences as much as the ear hears, that vibrates the chest cavity and creates the particular sensation of being physically present inside a large sound rather than merely receiving it from outside. This is the voice that the architecture of deep time suggests. Not a roar, but a resonance. Not an explosion of sound, but a long, sustained vibration, the kind of sound that a reed instrument makes when it has been given all the time in the world to find its note and then hold it. The kind of sound that moves through air and water and earth alike, that arrives at the listener already softened by distance, already woven into the general texture of the night, indistinguishable at its edges from the sound of the world itself humming quietly at its own resonant frequency. Other dinosaurs had other structures. Some had crests that varied dramatically between sexes, suggesting that the differences in pitch and timbre were important for mate selection, in the way they are in frogs, in birds, in almost every vocalizing animal that has ever lived. Some had elaborate nasal passages without external crests, the resonating chambers hidden within the skull like the body of a stringed instrument, invisible but acoustically essential. Some were likely capable of producing infrasonic calls, sounds below the threshold of human hearing, vibrations felt rather than heard. The kind of communication used by modern elephants to coordinate herd movements across distances of many kilometers without alerting predators or competing groups to their presence. You do not hear those infrasonic calls now. They are below the reach of any frequency your ears are built to detect. But you might, if you are still enough and the distractions of the day have sufficiently receded, feel something that approximates them, a low settling in the chest, a gentle heaviness in the air around you, the particular quality of silence that exists not when there is truly no sound, but when the sound is too deep and too slow to register as sound at all, when the vibration is coming up through the floor and settling into the bones without first passing through the recognized channels of the auditory system. The world around you is full of this kind of presence, this deep vibrational speech of enormous bodies in an enormous landscape. The night is not silent. It has never been silent. It is humming in frequencies that the bones can feel. With the slow, patient, endlessly patient conversation of creatures that have been making these sounds for so long that the sounds have become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. The low thrum of the hadrosaurs at the edge of the forest, the infrasonic pulse of something very large moving slowly through the reed bed somewhere to the south, the world breathing its own name into the dark over and over, in a register so deep that it is less a sound than a state of being. The architecture of the ancient voice was built for exactly this. Not for alarm, not for the sharp, attention-claiming sounds of aggression or territorial defense, or the explosive vocalizations of an animal in distress. It was built for contact, for the simple, essential, daily affirmation that other members of your kind are present in the night, that the herd is intact, that the world is as it should be, that sleep, when it comes, can come safely into a landscape that is acoustically familiar and acoustically secure. The ancient voice was built to say, I am here. The night is as it should be. You can rest. The Crocodilians carry another piece of this acoustic puzzle, and it is worth dwelling on because it represents perhaps the most direct evidence we have for what the acoustic world of the Mesozoic felt like from the inside of a receiving body. When a large American alligator produces its infrasonic vibration display in the early breeding season, standing in shallow water with its body submerged to the waterline, and producing those rapid low pulses that cause the water to dance in the characteristic pattern researchers call the water dance, the effect on a human observer who is close enough is not primarily auditory. It is somatic. It is felt in the chest, in the abdominal cavity, in the bones of the skull. It is experienced in the honest subjective account of people who have been near it, not as hearing a sound, but as being inside a sound, being held within it, surrounded by it, unable to say precisely where it is coming from because it seems to come from everywhere simultaneously. This is the experience that the acoustic architecture of the large dinosaurs was designed to produce in those other dinosaurs that received their calls, not a targeted auditory message delivered from point A to point B, an ambient acoustic field, a shared vibrational environment in which all members of the group were simultaneously embedded and from which all of them derived the same fundamental information. The group is here, the night is safe, the world is proceeding as it should. The architecture of the ancient voice was social architecture as much as biological architecture, a structure for creating and maintaining acoustic community in a world too large and too varied for visual community to serve the same purpose. There is something in this worth receiving as a personal gift in the context of this particular night. Your nervous system was not designed in isolation. It was designed, over the long history of your ancestral lineage, within communities, within groups, within the acoustic social structures that every mammal and every vertebrate before them used to maintain the cohesion of the group through the dark hours. You are built for the sounds of shared nights. You are built to find, in the ambient low frequencies of a world that is inhabited by large calm things, the particular safety signal that says, the group is intact, the night is managed, your individual vigilance can stand down. The ancient voice is speaking to something real in you when it does this. Something that was listening for exactly this kind of signal long before you were born. One more thing about the architecture of the ancient voice before we leave this subject and travel deeper into the night. The architecture was not fixed. It was not a single design produced once and maintained unchanged across the entire duration of the dinosaur lineage. It was a dynamic, evolving, constantly diversifying set of structures that varied between species and between individuals and between ages and between sexes in ways that we are only beginning to understand. A juvenile Parasaurolophus, whose crest was still developing, produced a different call from its fully developed adult counterpart. A female of a dimorphic species produced a different call from a male. The calls of an old individual, whose crest structures have been modified by decades of growth and possibly by the minor distortions of aging, would have been subtly different from the calls of a prime-age adult. The acoustic world of the Hadrosaur herd was not monotone but polyphonic, a genuine musical ensemble in which each member contributed a slightly different voice to the whole being richer and more complex and more beautiful for the variation. That acoustic diversity, that richness of individual variation within the shared frequency range of the species, is another feature of the prehistoric soundscape that the popular roar strips away entirely. The roar is generic. The roar is the sound of a species type rather than the sound of an individual. But real animals, in real acoustic worlds, are individuals, and their calls carry individual signature the way all natural voices carry individual signature. The slight variations in timbre and pitch and timing that allow a mother to recognize her calf's call from among the calls of a dozen other calves, that allow a pair-bonded bird to recognize its mate's song from across a territory, that allow a herd of hundreds to maintain acoustic identity as individuals even while participating in the collective sound of the group. The prehistoric herd was full of individuals with individual voices, and the night that held them was full of this particular richness, the polyphony of many individuals using the same instrument to say slightly different things, all of it together adding up to something that was more than the sum of its voices. If you're beginning to drift now, let yourself go. There is nothing here that requires your vigilance. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. It is somewhere in the middle of the night, the deep middle, the hour when the last light of dusk has been entirely swallowed, and the first grey suggestion of dawn is still many hours away. You are in what will become, 75 million years from now, the interior of the North American continent, though no such continent exists yet in the form you know it. The land here is lower and flatter than the American West of your own time, warmer and more heavily forested, bisected by the shallow inland sea that divided the landmass from north to south. A slow, warm body of water stretching for thousands of kilometres, teeming with ammonites and mosasaurs and the ancient ancestors of modern fish, its surface smooth and dark and carrying the reflected light of the stars above. The forest around you is not entirely dark. The sky above the canopy carries a faint luminescence, the accumulated light of millions of stars unfiltered by any light pollution, and on clear nights, in this world without cities, that starlight is enough to lay a thin silver wash over the upper surface of the leaves and make the darkness below slightly less absolute. When you look up through gaps in the canopy, the individual stars are visible in extraordinary numbers, far more than any modern city dweller ever sees, and the Milky Way is not a vague smear at the periphery of vision, but a clearly defined river of light arching from horizon to horizon, its density and complexity unmistakable. Everything smells of growth and moisture, and the sweet, slightly fermented scent of fallen fruit, rotting slowly in the understory, and of the particular mineral earthiness of soil that has been wet for a very long time, and is full of the invisible biological activity of decomposition and renewal. The air is warm. This part of North America in the Late Cretaceous carries a warmth that is not quite tropical, not the aggressive wet heat of an equatorial forest, but a sustained gentle warmth that has been in the ground and in the water and in the air for so long that the entire environment is saturated with it. The way a room that has been heated all day by sunlight carries that warmth long into the evening after the sun has gone. The trees around you are not the trees of the modern world, though some of the families they belong to will survive to your own time. There are palms shorter and denser than their modern descendants. There are ancient conifers, their bark thick and grooved, their canopies dark and dense above. There are flowering plants, more recently evolved than the conifers, and still, in this period, in the process of proliferating and diversifying and filling every available ecological niche with their extraordinary variety. The understory between the larger trees is thick with ferns of many kinds, some low and delicate, others chest-high and broad-leafed, their fronds catching whatever light filters through and holding it in a pale green shimmer. You are near the edge of the forest, where the trees thin and give way to a broad floodplain, and that floodplain is where the Hadrosaurs have gathered for the night. There are many of them, too many to count easily in the available light. The herd moved here in the late afternoon, following the river downstream toward a wide bend where the shallows offered easy wading, and the muddy banks are rich with the low vegetation they prefer. They have been here since before dark, and now, in the deep quiet of the middle hours, most of them are standing or lying with that characteristic stillness of large herbivores at rest. Their metabolism slowed, their weight settled into the soft ground, their eyes half closed against the night. The first call comes from the edge of the herd, from a young adult female whose crest is not yet fully developed but already produces a clear resonant tone that carries cleanly across the open ground. It is not a loud sound, not at this distance. If you did not know to listen for it, you might miss it entirely in the general texture of the night. But it is insistent, and it rises slowly, holds for several seconds at its peak, then drops and ends. There is a pause in which the insects continue their background chorus, and the river makes its quiet sound against the banks. Then from somewhere deeper in the herd an answer, lower in pitch, longer in duration, a sound that seems to come from inside the earth as much as from any individual throat, a sound that you feel in the soles of your feet before you clearly hear it. This is how the herd speaks at night, not in the complicated, rapid exchanges of distress or mating display that characterize the more theatrical moments of their communication, but in this slow, easy, low-frequency dialogue that serves a simple and essential function: presence, confirmation, the acoustic equivalent of the assertion that everything is as it should be. The calls move through the herd like a slow wave, each individual confirming its position, its wakefulness, its membership in the community of bodies that makes the night feel safe. The message is not complex. It does not need to be complex. The message is simply, I am here, I am here, I am here. Researchers studying modern birds have identified a category of vocalization they call contact calls, brief, low-energy sounds produced not to signal alarm or attract mates or defend territory, but simply to maintain awareness of the group, to stitch individuals together acoustically across space and darkness. Geese make them when flying in formation, that constant soft gabbling that maintains the cohesion of the flock through cloud and dark. Parrots make them when resting in trees. Many songbirds make them in the dark, quiet little chirps and murmurs that seem to serve no purpose to human ears, but that function within the social fabric of the flock as an ongoing census, a constant confirmation that the group is intact and everyone is accounted for. The night calls of the Hadrosaur herd carry the same function, performed in a register that the entire floodplain can feel. As you stand at the edge of the floodplain and let your eyes adjust to the available light, the shapes of the herd begin to resolve from the darkness. The Hadrosaurs are much larger than you expected them to be. The largest individuals stand 5 or 6 meters at the shoulder, and they carry that height easily, without the ungainly heaviness that size can sometimes give to an animal. They move, when they move at all, with a certain slow assurance, like animals that have no predatory anxiety about their immediate surroundings. They know each other. They know the geography of the floodplain. They know the smell of the river and the particular quality of the night breeze from the south, and the sound that the trees make in that breeze versus the sound they make in the wind from the north that sometimes carries the scent of predators. The calves are gathered near the centre of the herd. Several of them are clustered near a large adult, possibly the mother of at least some of them, and they are producing their own sounds, shorter and higher than the adult calls, something between a trill and a hum, a sound that reminds you of nothing so much as the sound of a string section settling into tune, a kind of musical restlessness that is not distress but is not yet fully at rest either. The adult near them responds with a low, slow call that the calves seem to find settling. You can see, even at this distance, the slight relaxation in their postures as the call reaches them. One by one, their own calls subside. The small bodies stop their slight restless movements and become still. Sleep is coming to the herd. You can feel it happening, not as an individual event, but as a collective one, a gradual lowering of the general alertness, a slowing of the constant small adjustments and repositionings that characterize wakeful animals. The calls grow further apart. The intervals of silence grow longer. The few individuals that are still moving, still wading through the shallows with their heads down, browsing on aquatic plants, begin to slow their movements and drift closer to the central mass of the resting herd. The collective metabolism of the herd is declining, the individual animals entering the states of reduced arousal that will, over the next hour, deepen into something approaching sleep. Somewhere to the north, far enough away that the sound arrives greatly reduced by distance, something large is moving through the forest. The herd registers it without alarm, a slight lifting of several heads, a momentary tightening of the collective attention, 2 or 3 of the larger adults producing brief low calls that seem to be addressed toward the sound rather than to each other, a query in the acoustic grammar of the species, asking the night what is there. And then the release. Whatever is moving in the northern forest is going away, not toward the floodplain, and the herd settles back into its patient communal rest, with a slowness that is itself a kind of sound, the sound of tension dissolving back into the general quiet. Notice how the herd does this. notice the efficiency of it. A possible threat is perceived, acknowledged, assessed, and dismissed in the space of perhaps a minute, and then the whole organism of the herd returns to its resting state without apparent difficulty, without the prolonged arousal that might in another kind of nervous system keep the body alert and wakeful for hours after the stimulus has passed. This is one of the great gifts of the collective, of the herd, the distributed nervous system, the shared vigilance that allows any individual animal within it to sleep more deeply because it knows the whole is watching. No individual in this herd must remain fully alert all night. The alertness is shared, rotated, maintained by the group so that each member can afford deeper rest than it could ever achieve alone. The stars above the floodplain are extraordinary. In the absence of any competing light, the Milky Way is not a smear at the edge of visibility, but a fully realized structure that arches from horizon to horizon, dense and multidimensional, layers of stars behind layers of stars, depth upon depth, the whole band of the galaxy laid across the sky in a display that has not been visible to human eyes anywhere on Earth for generations. The Hadrosaurs stand beneath it without looking up, unaware of and unconcerned by the spectacle overhead, present entirely in the world of smell and sound and the pressure of other warm bodies nearby, in the world of the ground beneath their feet and the water moving slowly past their legs in the shallows. The river makes a sound along its banks that is partly the sound of water over stones and partly the sound of water meeting the fine sediment of the floodplain and partly the sound of small aquatic creatures moving through the shallows. These sounds are not loud. They are part of the general texture of the night, part of the background against which the Hadrosaur calls rise and fall, and the insects maintain their chorus, and the wind moves through the upper canopy of the forest in slow waves. Everything here is part of a single enormous acoustic event, a sound that has been going on, in different forms and with different participants, since the first organisms developed the ability to produce vibration, and the first nervous systems developed the ability to receive it. The calls are coming less frequently now. The intervals between them are long enough that the background sounds of the night fill them completely. The insect chorus and the frog calls and the river, and the faint creak of the forest settling under the cooling air. There is something in that rhythm, the slow pulse of call and response with its long, quiet intervals, that the body responds to in a particular way, as a kind of pacing, as a clock whose ticking is measured in minutes rather than seconds, and whose beat is so slow that following it requires the breath to slow, the thoughts to space themselves further apart, the distance between one moment and the next to expand until there is room in that distance for rest. One of the larger adults, a male whose crest is fully developed and whose body carries the particular bulk of a fully mature animal, has waded into the shallows to mid-leg depth and is standing very still in the water. You cannot tell if he is sleeping or merely resting in the way that large animals sometimes rest. Present enough to respond to alarm but deeply enough settled that his inner experience is closer to the edge of sleep than to full wakefulness. His head is lowered slightly. His eyes, if you could see them, are probably half closed. His breathing is slow enough to be almost undetectable from this distance. He has produced no calls in the last 15 minutes. He is simply standing in the warm water in the middle of the Cretaceous night, present and alive and very nearly asleep, and the sound of the water moving gently around his legs is the only evidence that time is passing at all. A call rises from somewhere in the middle of the herd, lower and longer than the earlier ones, almost below the range of clear hearing, a sound that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. It hangs in the air for a long moment, that sustained low note, and in it you can hear all of the previous calls of the night, all of the preceding hours of this particular conversation that the herd has been having with itself since the light faded, all of the slow, patient affirmation of presence and safety condensed into a single sustained tone. It dissolves, very slowly, the way a note dissolves, when a skilled player allows it to fade rather than cutting it, and the silence that follows is the particular silence of a world that has decided, collectively and without announcement, to sleep. Let that call reach you now, wherever you are. Across the 75 million years and the continents and the extinctions and the long silence, something of its frequency still exists. Not as a recording, not as a sound you can play, but as a shape, as a pattern that the air knows how to carry, that the body knows how to receive. The call that settled the Hadrosaur calves into sleep on a warm Cretaceous night is the same call in principle, in biological function, in acoustic physics that settles you now. It says the same thing that it said then. It says, "The herd is here. The night is safe. You can rest now. Everything is as it should be." The silence that follows the last deep call is not an ordinary silence. It is a post-call silence, the specific quiet that falls in the immediate aftermath of a sustained low-frequency vocalization, when the air is still vibrating slightly at frequencies below the threshold of clear hearing, and the ground beneath your feet is still conducting the last remnants of the call's energy outward in slow concentric rings. This is a silence with a texture, a silence that the body receives as sound's continuation rather than sound's absence, and in that textured silence, there is something the nervous system recognizes as completion, as resolution, as the acoustic equivalent of the final note of a piece of music played by a very patient musician in a very large room. The night is very deep now, the hour when even the most committed of the large animals has yielded to the metabolic necessity of rest, and the floodplain has reached its quietest point, the point where the only sounds are the river and the insects and the occasional brief contact call of a hadrosaur checking in from the edge of sleep. This is the hour that this story has been working toward from its first paragraph, the deep hour, the quiet hour, the hour that exists in every night that has ever passed on the surface of this planet and that exists now, in your own night, where the world outside wherever you are has reached its own version of this same deep quiet. The ancient night and your night are not so different in this hour. They are both the same thing, the world holding still for a moment, for as long as you need, in the oldest and most reliable dark. There is a paper published by researchers at the University of Texas at Austin in the year 2016 that changed, quietly and without much fanfare outside of scientific circles, the way that biologists think about how dinosaurs may have communicated. The paper was not about any fossilized vocal structure. It was not about a preserved sound. It was about a living bird, a bird that exists today in the warm wetlands of North America and South America, a bird called the dove, and specifically about the way the dove produces its characteristic cooing call. Because the dove, it turns out, does not make its cooing call the way most birds make their calls. It does not open its beak and push air through a syrinx in the ordinary fashion. It coos with its beak closed. The call comes from inside, resonating in the esophagus and the oral cavity, shaped by a mouth that is not open, but is instead held deliberately shut to create the precise resonating chamber that produces that particular soft, carrying, deeply familiar sound. This discovery opened a door that researchers had not quite realized was closed. If modern birds, the direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs, use closed-mouth vocalization to produce calls that travel efficiently through complex environments, then it becomes at least plausible, perhaps probable, that their dinosaur ancestors used the same mechanism. And closed-mouth vocalization, when you follow the acoustics of it, has properties that are profoundly different from open-mouth calling. It is lower in frequency. It carries further through dense vegetation. It travels through the ground as well as through the air. And it does not, crucially, require the vocal apparatus to be visible or identifiable to a potential predator. An animal that calls with its mouth closed is an animal whose call is harder to locate, harder to track, harder to follow through a forest or a floodplain to its source. Picture the world this opens, not the roaring, open-mouthed, declaratively aggressive world of the movie screen, but a world of closed mouths and hidden sounds, a world where communication happens not through visible displays of open jaws and exposed teeth, but through invisible vibrations that move through the ground and the air and the water simultaneously, carrying meaning to those who share the frequency and remaining largely imperceptible to those who do not. It is a quieter world in the conventional sense, a world where the dominant sounds are felt rather than simply heard, where the most important acoustic events happen below the threshold of what we conventionally call noise. It is a world where everything is speaking, but not loudly, and not all of it to you. The forest in which you find yourself now is an older world than the Hadrosaur floodplain of the previous hour. This is the Jurassic, perhaps 150 million years ago, a period when the flowering plants have not yet established their dominance and the great forests are overwhelmingly coniferous, dense stands of ancient trees whose ancestors gave rise to the pines and the firs and the sequoias of the modern world, though none of the modern species exist here yet. The ground beneath your feet is carpeted with ferns and mosses and the strange early flowering plants that are just beginning to appear at the edges of the ecosystem, testing and probing the available niches with their remarkable biological inventiveness. The night air is warm and dense with the smell of resin, of crushed fern, of the particular damp earthiness of a forest that has been accumulating organic matter for millions of years without disturbance. There is water nearby, a slow stream that you can hear but not quite see from where you're standing, its sound muffled by the vegetation between you and it, arriving as a gentle, continuous murmur that underlies everything else in the acoustic landscape, the way a bass note underlies a more complex musical passage. The Stegosaurs have been here since mid-afternoon, a small group of 4 individuals who arrived at this section of the forest, following paths that their own feet have worn over years of repeated passage. They do not look like the creatures of the imaginary dinosaur worlds, the creatures of the film posters and the children's encyclopedias, because those representations, however detailed, tend to flatten and simplify and drain the colour and the texture and the sheer biological specificity from what were, in their actual lives, complicated and idiosyncratic animals. The stegosaurs you're watching now have a quality of physical presence that no static image quite captures, a sense of weight and warmth and biological busyness, the constant small adjustments of an animal whose body is always doing something, always processing, always maintaining the remarkable equilibrium of a living system. The plates along their backs, those famous bony projections arranged in the alternating rows, are not the dull grey of bare bone. They are covered in skin, and the skin is supplied with blood vessels, and in the warm air of the Jurassic night those blood vessels are visible as a faint pattern of darker colour against the lighter base tone of the skin itself, a vascular map that would have been readable to another stegosaur in ways we can only guess at. Some researchers have proposed that the plates flushed with blood during moments of social significance, becoming more deeply coloured in ways that communicated emotional or physiological state, the way that a human face can betray emotion through changes in colour that the face's owner cannot control and may not even be aware of. The dominant individual in this small group, the largest female, is producing a sound that you almost miss the first time you hear it. It is very low. It is close to the lower threshold of human hearing, in that zone where sound and vibration become indistinguishable, where what you receive through your ears and what you receive through the soles of your feet and the bones of your skull are essentially the same event experienced through different sensory systems simultaneously. It is not a sustained tone but a series of pulses, very slow, perhaps 2 per second, each one a discrete event separated from the next by a space of silence that is itself acoustically meaningful, the way the spaces between words are as necessary to meaning as the words themselves. The other 3 stegosaurs are receiving this communication. You can see it in the slight shifts of their attention, the small realignments of their bodies toward the source of the sound, the subtle changes in their posture that indicate received information being processed and incorporated. They are not alarmed. They are not being alarmed. The sound is not an alarm call. It is, in the acoustic grammar of this species, something more like a statement of occupancy, a claim on this particular space at this particular time, a declaration whose subtext is, I am here, I am large, I am calm. This night is mine and you are welcome in it. Infrasound. That is the word that researchers use for sounds at the low end of the frequency spectrum, sounds that human ears can sometimes detect at the very edge of their range, but that many animals produce and receive with much greater clarity and at much greater distances. Elephants use infrasound to communicate across several kilometres of savanna. Whales use it to communicate across ocean basins. The frequencies involved travel enormous distances, because the air absorbs them less efficiently than it absorbs higher-pitched sounds, and because they couple easily to the ground and to water, travelling through those denser media with even greater efficiency than through air alone. An elephant standing in a forest can produce a low rumble that travels through the ground and is received by the feet and legs of other elephants more than a kilometre away, long before any airborne component of the call could be detected by the ears. When researchers modelled the acoustic properties of the crests of various Hadrosaur species, they found resonant frequencies in the range of 30 to 40 Hz. This is very low. It is close to the lower edge of the range that a typical human being can hear as a distinct pitched sound, and it is well within the range that the human body can detect as a felt vibration without necessarily perceiving it as sound at all. 30 Hz, sustained, would be felt in the chest cavity, it would be felt in the bones of the skull, it would be felt in the abdomen. It is the frequency range of a large pipe organ's lowest notes, of the lowest notes of a double bass played in a very large room, and those notes, when you encounter them in the physical world, do not feel like sound exactly. They feel like the world itself producing a vibration, a geological event on a small scale, a reminder that sound and matter are not separate things, but two aspects of the same physical reality. The largest female stegosaur has moved slightly, repositioning herself closer to the stream, and as she does, she produces a new call, slightly higher than the previous ones, something closer to what you could clearly identify as a pitch. It lasts for perhaps 8 seconds, rising slowly through its duration and then dropping at the end, and it moves through the forest in every direction simultaneously, carried by the air in arcs that follow the curves of the trees and the depressions in the ground and the surfaces of the ferns, and carried by the earth itself in a slower, more patient wave that will continue to travel long after the airborne component has been absorbed by the vegetation. You can feel it if you are very still and very attentive in the particular quality of the moment, not as a sound necessarily, but as a thickening of the air, a slight sense of presence, as if the night itself has deepened by one register. This is what infrasound does to the organism that receives it. It does not startle, it does not alert. It registers as something closer to an environmental fact, a quality of the space rather than an event within the space, and the body's response to it is not to wake up and pay attention, but to settle slightly, to acknowledge at a level below conscious thought that the large animal nearby is neither alarmed nor alarming, is simply there, is simply producing the sounds of its existence in the warm dark, and that those sounds carry in their very low frequency the implicit information that everything is as it should be. The stegosaur group settles into their nighttime arrangement, the 4 individuals positioned with a particular spatial logic that reflects the social hierarchy of the group and the practical demands of shared vigilance. The largest female is at the forest edge. The 2 middle-aged adults are positioned slightly back from her, their bodies angled in a way that maximizes each animal's field of sensory coverage without creating the blind spots that would result from all 4 animals facing the same direction. The youngest animal, a subadult who's not yet socially mature, but is large enough to be part of the group's defensive perimeter, is on the far side, facing the densest part of the forest. The calls continue, intermittent, low, felt as much as heard. They move through the forest in the way that all low-frequency sounds move through dense environments, following the path of least resistance, bending around obstacles, coupling to surfaces and travelling along them, arriving at the receiving animal from multiple directions simultaneously because they have taken multiple paths. The effect, for an animal whose sensory system is tuned to receive these frequencies, would be something like the experience of being surrounded by the call even when the calling animal is in a specific location, because the sound has taken so many paths through the environment that it arrives from everywhere at once. This is the acoustic world that the closed-mouth vocalizations of the great dinosaurs created. Not a world of directional signals pinpointing the locations of specific individuals, but a world of diffuse acoustic presence, a world where being known to be there was more important than being known to be precisely there, where communication happened not through the exchange of targeted messages, but through the maintenance of a shared acoustic field in which every member of the species was embedded and from which every member derived information about the state of the world. It was a world of ambient communication, where the medium was not speech but presence, where what was said was not complex but what was meant was everything. The night is intact, the herd is here, the world is proceeding, you can rest. Let the low call of the stegosaur reach you now across the enormous distance of time. It is not a frightening sound. It was never a frightening sound. It is a sound that announces the existence of something very large and very calm in the warm dark, and that announcement, in the emotional vocabulary of every nervous system that has ever existed, carries one meaning above all others. It says, this space is already inhabited by something much larger than whatever might threaten you, and that large thing is calm, and so the space is safe, and so you can close your eyes, and so you can let the breath slow, and so you can allow the extraordinary complicated business of being awake to gradually, gently, without hurry, begin to dissolve. The information density of low-frequency communication is lower than the information density of high-frequency communication. in the purely technical sense that fewer distinct signals can be packed into a given unit of time at low frequencies than at high ones. But this apparent limitation is, in the context of the prehistoric night, not a limitation at all. The large dinosaurs did not need to communicate complex or rapidly changing information at night. The night called not for information exchange, but for the simpler, deeper function of presence maintenance, confirming that the group was intact, confirming that the environment was undisturbed, confirming the ongoing fact of shared occupation of the same acoustic space. For this purpose, a low-frequency vibration held for several seconds and received by every body within a kilometre was not just sufficient. It was ideal. It was the perfect medium for the perfect message. The stegosaur group has fallen fully silent now. The last low pulse faded several minutes ago and was not answered, which in the acoustic grammar of these animals means not that the conversation has ended, but that the conversation has reached its natural conclusion for this night, that everything that needed to be said has been said, that the group is intact and the forest is safe and the night is, at last, purely for rest. You can feel the silence the way you feel the silence after a sustained note from a large instrument has finally decayed as a kind of resonant aftermath, as the air still carrying the ghost of the vibration even after the vibration itself has stopped. This is the prehistoric night at its deepest and most still. This is the sound, or the absence of sound, that you have been travelling toward. It is worth saying something about the evolutionary pressures that produced closed-mouth vocalization in the first place, because those pressures illuminate something interesting about the relationship between sound and safety in the prehistoric world. An animal that calls with its mouth open is an animal whose call can be traced to its source by any predator with sufficient auditory acuity, and most predators have extremely good auditory acuity in exactly the frequency ranges that their prey uses. An animal that calls with its mouth closed, producing sounds that travel simultaneously through the air and the ground, and that arrive at the listener from multiple directions, because they have taken multiple acoustic paths through the environment, is an animal whose call is much harder to source locate. The closed-mouth call says I am here without saying precisely where here is, and in a world full of predators with sharp ears, the distinction between those two messages is the difference between advertising your location and advertising your existence, which are very different things. The Hadrosaurs, moving through a world in which Tyrannosaurus and other large theropods were genuine and effective threats, would have benefited enormously from a calling strategy that maintained social cohesion without broadcasting precise location to every predator in the vicinity. The closed-mouth call, produced at low frequencies that travelled through the ground as much as through the air, that arrived at herd members from the ground up through their feet, rather than directionally through their ears, that were felt as vibration rather than heard as clearly located sound. This was not just acoustically interesting. It was a survival strategy, built into the architecture of the skull and the respiratory system, shaped by millions of years of predation pressure into the most effective acoustic solution to the particular problem of being a very large and necessarily vocal animal in a world full of things that would eat you. Travel back further now, deeper into the dark of deep time, past the Cretaceous world we have just left, past the boundary between those two great periods, past 70 million years of accumulated life and change and extinction and emergence. We find ourselves in a different world, recognizable in its broad outlines, familiar in the blue of its sky and the green of its vegetation, and the way the sun moves through its days, but strange in its particulars in a way that makes the strangeness itself beautiful rather than disorienting. The Jurassic period, that long middle chapter of the Mesozoic era, spanning roughly 62 million years, from approximately 201 million to approximately 145 million years ago. Longer, if you let yourself feel the weight of it, than the entire subsequent history of the Earth species that includes us. A span of time so vast that the number itself becomes meaningless and must be felt rather than understood. The landscape you find yourself in now is denser and more uniformly green than the Cretaceous world you just visited. The flowering plants that will come to dominate the later world have not yet arrived in any significant diversity, and the vegetation here is all gymnosperms and ferns and cycads, and the ancient conifers whose descendants still stand in the high mountain ranges of your own time. Only here they are younger versions of those old species, their lines not yet diverged into the particular shapes they will eventually take, their bark smoother, their growth more exuberant, the forest floor beneath them thick with ferns of every description. The air is noticeably warmer and slightly more humid than the Cretaceous air, and the light that filters through the canopy during the day is richer and more golden, as if the sunlight itself has a different quality in this older time. But it is night again in this story, and what you have come for is sound, and what the Jurassic night offers in the way of sound is unlike anything you have heard in the Cretaceous world, because the Jurassic night belongs, among other creatures, to the sauropods. The sauropods were, by almost any measure, the most extraordinary animals that have ever lived on land. Their size is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a stable image. It keeps expanding as you approach it. The largest individuals of species like Brachiosaurus or Argentinosaurus, or the recently described Patagotitan majorum from the Patagonian deposits of Argentina, approached lengths of 30 to 40 meters, measured nose to tail in the casual way one might measure a building. They stood as tall as 5 or 6 meters at the shoulder, and their necks extended forward and upward from those shoulders for another 10 or 15 meters, placing the small head at a height of 12 to 18 meters above the ground, 4 or 5 stories up, where it moved among leaves that no other land animal could reach. They weighed in the largest individuals as much as 70 or 80 tons. They moved slowly through the Jurassic forests like organic weather systems, their passage detectable from kilometers away through the ground vibrations they produced with every step. Their bodies requiring such quantities of food that they kept entire forests in a state of perpetual regeneration, the landscape reshaping itself continuously around their needs. What did they sound like? The honest answer is that we do not know, and we know that we do not know, which is itself a kind of scientific honesty that is worth honouring. But the thinking about it, the careful following of the biological evidence where it leads, arrives somewhere genuinely interesting. Consider the neck. The sauropod neck was not simply a scaled-up version of a shorter neck. It was a highly specialised structure with a complex internal architecture, full of air sacs and pneumatic cavities that reduced its weight, and that also had, as a secondary consequence of their structure, significant acoustic properties. Modern birds have a system of air sacs throughout their bodies that are integral to their one-directional respiratory process, in which air flows through the lungs in a single direction rather than back and forth as in mammalian lungs, and these air sacs also play a role in sound production and amplification. The air sacs in a sauropod's neck, pneumatic spaces that researchers have identified from the characteristic texture they leave on the bones that surrounded them, would have been, in the largest species, volumes of air comparable to the internal space of a large musical instrument, a cello or a double bass, with all the resonating properties that implies. Air moving through chambers of that size, vibrating at frequencies determined by the geometry and volume of those chambers, would have produced sounds in the very lowest registers, sounds whose wavelengths were measured in meters rather than in the centimeters that characterize most animal vocalizations. The neck itself would have functioned as a resonating column, the way the neck of a guitar or the tube of a trombone shapes and amplifies and colors the sounds generated by the instrument's primary sound-producing element. A call generated deep in the chest of a large sauropod, and then shaped by the passage through the extraordinary length and complexity of the neck, would have emerged from the small head at the top of that column as something already transformed by the instrument that carried it, deepened and enriched, and given the particular timbre of that particular body. On the floodplains and in the open forests of the Jurassic world, the sauropods gathered in groups, though perhaps not the tight herds of the hadrosaurs. The evidence from trackway sites, where the preserved footprints of many individuals tell a story about social behaviour that no single skeleton can tell, suggests that they moved together in loose associations, maintaining contact over distances that would have made visual communication unreliable through the dense Jurassic forest. Sound would have been essential to this kind of loose social cohesion, and low-frequency sound in particular, the kind that carried across kilometres and through dense vegetation with equal facility. The distance over which such calls could travel is not theoretical. Modern research into elephant communication, which operates in overlapping frequency ranges for similar biological reasons, has demonstrated that elephant infrasonic calls can be detected by other elephants across distances of several kilometres under favourable conditions. The Jurassic forest, which was wetter and denser than any savanna, and which had no traffic or industrial noise to compete with the calls, would have been a better acoustic medium in many respects, and the much larger bodies of the sauropods would have produced more powerful vibrations at lower frequencies, vibrations that would have coupled even more efficiently with the ground and the water and the air than elephant infrasound does. The calls of a large sauropod in the Jurassic night may have been detectable, as ground vibrations if not as airborne sound, from tens of kilometres away. Imagine it now, in the warm dark of the Jurassic night. The stars above the canopy even more numerous and undimmed than they will be in the Cretaceous night 60 million years later. The forest enormous and old, and full of the particular creaking sounds of very large trees settling in the cooler air, the insects singing their unvarying chorus, the frogs calling from the water, the general low hum of an old and active world going about its night business. And then, from somewhere beyond the nearest ridge, a sound that begins so low you feel it in your sternum before you hear it in your ears, a single note rising slowly from below the threshold of hearing into the very bottom edge of what your ears can detect, held for what seems like a very long time, long enough for 2 or 3 slow breaths, and then gradually falling again, back down into the infrasonic depths from which it came, leaving behind it a resonance in the air that seems to have no source, that seems to emanate from the landscape itself. Another sound answers it from a different direction, from further away, lower in pitch by perhaps 1/3 of a tone, which makes it almost impossible to consciously hear as lower, but which the body receives differently, the way the body receives a chord differently from a single note, registering not the individual frequencies but the relationship between them. Then 1/3 from somewhere behind you, so low that you can barely distinguish it from the general vibration of the ground under your feet. The 3 sounds find each other in the air above the forest, and combine into something that has no human analogue, a chord made of frequencies below the range of any musical instrument that has ever been built, played by the largest instruments in the history of the world. It is not a sound that produces alertness. It is not a sound that calls you to attention or sharpens your awareness of potential danger. It is a sound that does what all truly low frequencies do, that vibrates the chest cavity and the inner ear at a frequency close to the body's own resting rhythms, that synchronizes gently and without any demand or urgency the nervous system with the slow pulse of a world that has been here for a very long time and plans to be here for a very long time more. It is, in the most literal physiological sense, a sound that encourages the body to slow down, to settle, to release whatever it has been holding, to participate in the low, slow, ancient rhythm of the world at night. There is something additionally remarkable about the sauropod acoustic environment that deserves mention. The vibrations produced by the footsteps of a large sauropod, distinct from any deliberate vocalization, would themselves have been a form of communication, both ground-conducted and air-conducted. An adult Argentinosaurus taking a single step placed somewhere between 40 and 60 tons of weight on a single foot briefly, and the shockwave that created in the ground around it would have been detectable by any animal with suitable sensory equipment across a significant radius. Modern elephants have been demonstrated to detect the footstep vibrations of other elephants through their feet and their trunk, which is in contact with the ground during walking, and to interpret those vibrations correctly in terms of the direction and distance of the other animal. The sauropods, whose feet were much larger and whose bodies much heavier, would have produced footstep vibrations that were proportionally more powerful and more detectable. The sauropods have been making this sound every night for millions of years by the time you arrive to hear it, moving through their enormous territories in the dark, calling to the others of their kind across distances that make the scale of the forest feel comprehensible at last. They will make it for millions of years after you're gone. The night does not notice you. The forest does not notice you. The enormous slow beings that move through the dark on their ancient paths do not notice you. You are a guest here, as invisible and weightless as a thought, and the gift of being a weightless guest in the Jurassic night is that you are not required to do anything at all, not to move, not to speak, not even to remain fully awake. Somewhere in the branches above you, a small mammal, one of your own distant ancestors, tucks itself tighter into the curve of a branch and closes its eyes and sleeps without knowing that it is sleeping inside one of the most beautiful sounds that the world has ever made, that the low, slow music of the largest animals that have ever walked the land is passing through its small, warm body as it sleeps, carrying the information that the world is safe and large and full of presences that are not alarmed, that the night is what it should be, that sleep is, among all the things available to a small warm animal in the warm dark, the very best choice. Let yourself be that small warm animal. Let the enormous sounds of the enormous world move through you, the way they move through every small ancestor you have ever had, the way they move through every small mammal that ever tucked itself into a branch or a burrow in the Jurassic night and gave itself to sleep. The sounds are there. They are always there, in whatever night you find yourself in, at whatever distance or frequency or volume the particular ecology of your world allows. The instruction is always the same. The night is here. The large things are not alarmed. Rest is possible, and rest is right now. Everything. It is worth pausing to ask what it felt like, biologically and neurologically, to be a small mammal in the Jurassic forest listening to the calls of the sauropods. The small mammals of the Mesozoic were, as a group, nocturnal and prey species, and their nervous systems were tuned toward vigilance, toward the rapid detection of stimuli that might indicate threat. They had the kind of nervous systems that did not rest easily, that were always maintaining some low background level of alertness, always listening at the edges of sleep for the sounds that would require an immediate waking response. The sounds that did not require a response were the sounds of a safe night, the insect chorus, the frog calls, the river, the wind, and the infrasonic vibrations of the sauropods, felt through the ground and the air as a deep, slow pulse, were the largest safety signal available, the acoustic announcement that the biggest animals in the landscape were present and calm and proceeding about their business without alarm. Those small mammals slept better, in all probability, when the sauropods were nearby and calling than when the forest was truly silent, because the silence itself was ambiguous, might mean anything, while the deep vibration of the giants meant something specific and reassuring. The acoustics of the sauropod neck deserve one more consideration. The neck was not a rigid tube but a flexible structure capable of significant movement in multiple planes, and this flexibility had acoustic consequences. As the neck moved, the geometry of the resonating chambers within it changed, subtly shifting the resonant frequency of the system in the way that a trombone player shifts pitch by extending or retracting the slide. A sauropod that moved its neck while vocalizing would have produced calls that shifted in pitch as the neck moved, gliding through a range of frequencies rather than staying fixed at a single note. This is speculative, but the physics are real, and if this behavior occurred, the result would have been calls with a particular quality of movement and modulation, a sweeping quality that the mathematical models of the neck's acoustic properties suggest was possible. The sound of an enormous neck sweeping slowly through its range while the voice moves with it across the infrasonic spectrum is not a sound that any human has ever heard, but the imagination of it, grounded in real physics and real biology, is not nothing. It is a kind of music. The Jurassic forest is fully dark now around you. The stars above the canopy are brilliant and the air is warm, and the ground beneath your feet is conducting the faint residual vibrations of the last sauropod call, those traces that travel through the earth long after the airborne component has dissipated. Your feet are receiving information that your ears cannot. Your sternum is processing vibrations that have travelled a kilometre or more through the ground to reach you. This is what it means to inhabit the acoustic world of the Jurassic. It is not just an experience of hearing, but an experience of the entire body as a receiving instrument, the skin and the bones and the organs, as well as the ears, all participating in the reception of the world's extraordinary low sound. Dinosaurs did not have the night to themselves. They never did. The prehistoric night was layered with sounds that preceded the dinosaurs by hundreds of millions of years, and that will outlast them by hundreds of millions of years more, sounds that belong to the longer, older story of life on Earth, sounds that are in some ways the truest constant in the entire acoustic history of the world. The dinosaurs were guests in a soundscape that was already ancient when they arrived, a soundscape built by smaller and older and less glamorous creatures whose contributions to the music of the night were no less essential for being less frequently celebrated. Insects were among the first animals to produce sound, and they did so through mechanisms entirely different from those of vertebrates, involving not any modification of a respiratory system, but instead the direct mechanical interaction of body parts. Stridulation, the rubbing of one body part against another to produce a friction-generated tone, is the oldest and most widespread acoustic technique in the insect world, and the structures that produce it evolved independently in many different insect groups at many different times in the deep history of the class. The crickets, and the katydids, and the cicadas, and the various other stridulating insects of today are practicing a technique that their ancestors developed long before the first dinosaur evolved, a technique so fundamental and so reliable that it has persisted through every mass extinction event and every environmental upheaval of the last 400 million years. By the Jurassic period, insects were already producing nighttime sounds that were, in their essential character, recognizable to modern ears. Researchers working with exceptionally well-preserved Jurassic fossils have identified specimens of ancient katydids whose wings were preserved in enough detail to allow the acoustic properties of the stridulatory structures to be calculated. From those calculations, they produced actual sounds, played through modern speakers, sounds that emerge from the data of 75 million years ago as something you would recognize instantly as insect song if you heard it in a warm garden on a summer night. The deep continuity of that sound, the fact that the insects singing outside your window tonight are producing something functionally identical to what the insects of the Jurassic night produced, is one of the more quietly astonishing facts in the entire natural history of sound. A Jurassic summer night would have been filled with insect song from the moment the temperature dropped enough to trigger the evening chorus. The insects of the Mesozoic were not the specific species of today, but they were comparable in their ecological roles and in the sounds they produced, and the chorus they created would have been immediately recognizable to any modern person who has spent time near a warm-weather pond or in a field at night in the late summer. The same high frequencies, the same overlapping rhythms, the same sensation of being enclosed in a living sound that comes from every direction simultaneously without having any distinct source. The frogs were there too, or rather their ancestors were, the early amphibians and the first true frogs, whose origins date to before the dinosaurs, and whose calls have been the signature sound of every warm wet night in the hundreds of millions of years since. The acoustic environment of a Mesozoic swamp at night would have been, at its baseline, recognizable to anyone who has spent a night camping near a pond or a slow-moving river in the warm months. The background noise would have been familiar. The high, interlocking songs of thousands of small insects, the calls of frogs and proto-frogs from the water's edge, the occasional splash of something entering the water, the drip of condensation from leaves that have collected too much moisture for their surfaces to hold. This is worth pausing over because it contains a comfort that is not available from any other source. The sound you're hearing right now in the world outside wherever you are, if you listen for it beneath the other sounds of the modern world, the sound of insects on a warm night, and the calls of frogs from any nearby water, that sound is the same sound that filled the Mesozoic night. The specific insects are different. The specific frogs are different. But the acoustic function is the same, the frequencies are similar, and the relationship between that sound and the resting nervous system is identical. When you hear an insect chorus in the dark, you are receiving the same acoustic signal that has been telling the vertebrate nervous system for hundreds of millions of years that the night is ordinary, that the night is what it should be, that there is nothing in this sound that requires a response. Over this background, the larger sounds of the larger animals moved like ships over a sea. The low calls of the dinosaurs were not replacing the insect chorus. They were occurring simultaneously with it, layered over it the way the bass notes in an orchestra are layered over the higher instruments, each occupying its own frequency range, each perfectly audible without competing with or obscuring the others. The Mesozoic night was not a single sound, but a chord, a complex, multi-layered, endlessly modulated chord that changed hour by hour and season by season, as different species reached their peak of activity and then subsided. There were also the early crocodilians, the direct ancestors of the modern alligators and crocodiles, whose presence in Mesozoic wetlands is well attested by the fossil record, and whose behaviours were almost certainly similar to those of their modern descendants. Like modern crocodilians, they were vocal, producing low bellowing calls during the mating season, and the characteristic hissing and jaw-slapping that crocodilians use in territorial interactions. But outside the mating season, in the ordinary flow of an ordinary Mesozoic night, the crocodilians were quiet, resting on banks and in shallows, with that extraordinary stillness that modern crocodilians still maintain, so motionless that they seem less like animals than like stones that have, over millions of years, learned the precise texture of the shoreline. The turtles were present. The ancient beetles clicked and clicked in fallen logs, the sound carrying a short distance and then disappearing into the general insect background. Early lizards rustled through leaf litter in the dry hours before dew fell. Pterosaurs roosted in the trees, folding their extraordinary wings around themselves like cloaks, their small, sharp cries the highest sound in the nighttime soundscape, a counterpoint to the deep, low calls of the sauropods somewhere below them, so different in frequency that they occupied almost entirely different acoustic worlds and never competed for the same space in the air. Think of it as a living orchestral score, written over millions of years by the pressure of evolution, rather than by any individual hand or any single moment of creative intention. The highest registers belong to the insects, their ticking and singing and the dry rustle of their wing rubbing making a continuous high shimmer above everything else. The sound that arrives at the ears as a kind of auditory texture, rather than as a collection of individual sounds, a warm, slightly metallic, very slightly disorienting buzz that occupies the top of the frequency range and never completely stops. Slightly below them, the frogs and the small lizards, their calls punctuating the insect background with slightly lower, more irregular sounds. Each frog call a distinct event against the continuous insect background. Below the frogs, the middle register, mostly empty in the deep Jurassic, beginning to fill in the Cretaceous as the early birds diversified and the small feathered dinosaurs established their acoustic niches in the middle frequencies. And below all of that, the bass register, vast and slow and felt as much as heard, the domain of the large dinosaurs, the vibrational speech of enormous bodies in an enormous world, the lowest notes of the most ancient orchestra. The modern world has disrupted this ancient acoustic hierarchy in significant ways. The insect chorus is still there, in places where the ecological damage has not been too severe, though its composition has changed and in many parts of the world its volume has declined as insect populations have declined. The frog calls are still there, though in reduced numbers, the same calls that ancient frogs made being produced now by their descendants, in the same wetlands that remain wet. The low background sounds of large animals have changed most dramatically, because the large animals of the Mesozoic are gone, and the large mammals that replaced them, while producing their own infrasonic communications, do not replicate the prehistoric acoustic environment in the same way. But the principle remains, and the nervous system's response to the principle remains, and any night that is quiet enough and warm enough and undisturbed enough to let the insect song and the frog calls fill the air is a night that is, in the most relevant functional sense, the same as the Mesozoic night. You are inside all of it now. The insect song surrounds you from every direction. Not a single sound, but thousands of sounds happening simultaneously, each individual insect producing its own tiny contribution to the whole becoming something that no individual could produce, something that is genuinely more than the sum of its parts, a collective acoustic event that belongs to no one creature, and to all of them simultaneously. The frogs at the water's edge are calling in their own chorus, a different rhythm from the insects, lower in pitch, more intermittent, some calls answered and some not, a conversation that has been going on since before the first dinosaur walked the earth. Beneath your feet, the ground carries a faint vibration that has no specific source you can identify. It is simply there, in the substrate, in the mineral and organic world below the surface, the accumulated resonance of everything alive and moving in the forest above and below the ground, translated into earth-conducted vibration by the sheer mass and diversity and density of the living world. You feel it in the arches of your feet and in the fine bones of your inner ear, a sensation more like warmth than like sound, a quality of the air and the ground that the body interprets not as alarm, but as the simple fact of being inside a living system, surrounded by life in every direction, held within a world that is doing exactly what it's designed to do. This is what the ancient night sounded like, not the silence between roars, not the held breath between attacks, not the dramatic punctuation of predator and prey that fills the imagination when it thinks of the prehistoric world. This, the insect song and the frog calls and the deep low vibrations of enormous bodies at rest, layered into a chord that has been playing, with variations, for 400 million years, the oldest music in the world, the music your nervous system recognizes without being told to recognize it, because it was playing for a very long time before there were nervous systems like yours to hear it, and the fact of its oldness is written in your body, the way so many old things are written in the body quietly without announcement, as a kind of background comfort that you only notice when it stops. It does not stop here. The ancient chorus continues and continues, and you are welcome to simply rest inside it for as long as you need. There is a concept in ecology called soundscape ecology, a field that examines the acoustic properties of ecosystems as indicators of their health and diversity. The premise is elegant. A healthy, biodiverse ecosystem produces a rich, complex, multi-layered soundscape in which different species occupy different acoustic niches, different frequency ranges and different times of day, without excessive competition. A degraded ecosystem produces a thinner, simpler soundscape with fewer layers and less complexity. The soundscape of a Cretaceous forest, if we could hear it in its full fidelity, would be one of the richest, most complex soundscapes ever produced by life on Earth. Not just because of the diversity of species involved, but because of the extraordinary span of frequencies covered. From the infrasonic vibrations of the large dinosaurs through the insect chorus, all the way up to the ultrasonic calls of the earliest bats and echolocating mammals. The full acoustic spectrum would be occupied, every niche filled, the living world expressing its maximum biological richness through the medium of sound. You're in that soundscape now, or the imagination of it, which is not the same thing as the original but is not nothing either. The nervous system does not distinguish perfectly between an imagined sound and a real one, particularly when the imagination is grounded in genuine information, in the actual physics of sound propagation and the actual biology of the animals involved. The low vibration you feel in your chest, as this story describes it, is not the vibration of a Parasaurolophus, but the nervous system that receives it is the same nervous system that, over millions of years of evolutionary history, was trained to respond to that kind of vibration with exactly this: a slowing, a settling, a release. The acoustic niche hypothesis, formulated by bioacoustician Bernie Krause in the 1990s, and now widely accepted as a fundamental principle of soundscape ecology, proposes that in a healthy natural ecosystem, the different species that produce sound have evolved to occupy different acoustic niches, different frequency bands and different time periods, so that their calls do not overlap and compete, but instead complement each other, each species finding its own acoustic space within the shared soundscape. The result of this evolutionary pressure is that the sounds of a healthy ecosystem fit together like the instruments of a well-arranged orchestra, each contributing to the whole without crowding out the others. The Mesozoic soundscape, viewed through this lens, was perhaps the most perfectly acoustically partitioned environment that has ever existed on Earth, simply because it had had the most time to develop, 180 million years for the different groups to find their acoustic niches and evolve the anatomical structures that occupied them. The insects in the highest register, the amphibians in the mid-upper register, the early birds in the mid-register, the small mammals in the upper mid-register, the small dinosaurs across the mid-range, the large dinosaurs in the base, the crocodilians and the ground-conducted calls in the infrasonic and near-infrasonic range. Each group in its place, each place distinct, the whole forming a sound picture of extraordinary completeness and beauty. This is the chorus you're hearing now. This is what 400 million years of acoustic evolution sounds like. This is the most ancient music in the world. There is a temptation, when thinking about large predatory dinosaurs, to imagine them as perpetually active, perpetually hunting, perpetually engaged in the violent business that defines how they appear in the popular imagination. Every image of a Tyrannosaurus rex is an active image, roaring, chasing, feeding, threatening, displaying, existing in an explosive relationship with its environment. The stillness of the Tyrannosaurus, the quiet and restful and ordinary Tyrannosaurus that simply lived its days and its nights, as every living thing lives its days and nights, is not part of the cultural inheritance. But it is, in terms of the animal's actual life, far more representative. A large carnivore cannot spend all its time hunting. The metabolism cannot sustain it. The body requires rest. Even the Tyrannosaurus rex, even the great theropods, the apex predators of their world, the largest killing machines that evolution has ever designed for land-based predation, slept. Let yourself settle more deeply into wherever you are right now. The story has been moving through time, bringing you closer to the quiet center of the prehistoric night, and that center is here now. The most famous creature of the Mesozoic world, sleeping in the dark, you're allowed to find that restful. You're allowed to let it remind your own body that sleep is not a concession, but a biological necessity, not a retreat from the world, but the means by which any living thing maintains its relationship with the world over time. The evidence for sleep in dinosaurs comes from multiple directions, including from the fossilized eyes. The scleral rings, the bony structures that supported the eyeballs in many dinosaur and bird species, have been preserved in extraordinary detail in some fossils, and the size and structure of these rings can be used to make inferences about the visual ecology of the animal that possessed them. In modern birds and reptiles, the size and proportions of the scleral ring correlate with whether an animal is predominantly diurnal, nocturnal, or cathemeral, active at twilight. Small rings relative to the eye indicate daytime activity. Large rings indicate low light or nighttime specialization. The analysis of scleral rings in various dinosaur species has produced interesting results. Some dinosaurs, based on this evidence, appear to have been primarily diurnal. Others showed the large eyes and reinforced scleral rings of dedicated nocturnal hunters. Some were twilight animals, active in the low light of dawn and dusk, resting in the middle of the day and the deep hours of the night. The large tyrannosaurs, based on the size and structure of their optical anatomy and the high density of photoreceptors that their eye size suggests, appear to have been primarily diurnal or crepuscular, most active in daylight and declining twilight, and likely entering a period of sustained rest in the deep hours of the night. This does not mean they were inactive in darkness or unable to navigate it. It means that the deep Cretaceous night was, for many of the large theropods, a time of rest rather than a time of hunting. The metabolic logic of a large animal is clear on this point. The energy expenditure of maintaining full alertness and mobility is high, and the return on that expenditure, for an animal whose primary prey was also likely resting in the deep night, was low. The night was for rest. The hunting happened at the margins of the day. What did a Tyrannosaurus rex look like at rest? The question has been answered in part by the discovery of fossilized oviraptorid dinosaurs in brooding positions, bodies arranged over nests with arms spread low in the characteristic posture of a bird warming eggs, demonstrating conclusively that at least some theropods were capable of the folded, compact resting postures that modern birds use. Large retites like ostriches rest lying down, tucking their long necks back along their bodies in a posture that reduces both heat loss and the energetic cost of supporting the weight of the neck and head. The biomechanical analysis of the Tyrannosaurus neck and musculature suggests that a similar posture was not only possible, but was probably the resting default. The neck lowered, the head resting on or near the ground, the tiny forelimbs tucked close to the chest, the enormous tail extended behind providing balance and counterweight. A large tyrannosaur at rest, lying on the ground with its massive head lowered to the earth and its tail extended behind it, would have presented a profile almost unrecognizable to anyone whose image of the Tyrannosaurus is formed by the upright roaring stance of popular illustration. It would have looked, to a modern eye, something like a very large and toothily elaborate sleeping bird, and in the deep dark of the Cretaceous night, its sheer size and its horizontal profile would have made it a part of the landscape rather than an intrusion into it, just another large shadow among large shadows, breathing slowly in the dark. There is a forest clearing not far from the river, a place where a stand of ancient trees is thinned enough to allow a wider view of the sky overhead, and this is where the large adult female has chosen to spend the night. She arrived here before dark, having followed the river upstream to a bend where the drinking is easy, and having drunk deeply and at length in the way of large animals that can go a day or more between drinks, but do not waste an opportunity, she moved to this clearing and lay down with a particular deliberateness, a considered lowering of the enormous weight of herself, a settling of that weight into the soft ground, with a final slow exhalation that seemed to exhale not just air, but the last of the day's accumulated tension. She lies now with her head resting on a surface root of one of the largest trees, a natural pillow of sorts, and her eyes are closed. The small eyes of the Tyrannosaurus, relative to the enormous skull in which they are set, are closed, and the lids that cover them are not the lizard-dry lids of popular reptilian imagination, but something more complex, more bird-like, a layered structure that can close completely or partially, that can filter the available light to a precisely managed degree, and that, when fully closed in sleep, give the enormous face a quality of absolute repose that is unexpected and somehow moving. the way any creature's sleeping face carries something of the universal quality of rest. The sounds that such a resting animal made would have been the sounds of sleep itself, or of the states adjacent to sleep. The slow, deep rhythm of breathing, which in an animal the size of a Tyrannosaurus would have produced a considerable volume of air, moved in and out with each breath, the sound of that passage audible as a faint rhythmic rushing in the near vicinity of the animal. The occasional low vocalization that in modern crocodilians and large birds accompanies periods of rest or near sleep. Not a communicative call, but an almost involuntary sound. The body's self-produced white noise. The acoustic sign of relaxed muscles and slowing metabolism. The voice of the body talking to itself in its sleep. Among the more fascinating possibilities raised by recent research into dinosaur sensory systems is the question of whether some theropods, particularly the more derived coelurosaurs that were most closely related to birds, produced sounds in their sleep. Modern birds frequently vocalize during sleep, producing quiet versions of their waking calls during what appears to be a behavioral form of vocal practice, a kind of nocturnal rehearsal of the sounds they will need during the waking hours, a process that some researchers believe plays a role in the learning and consolidation of vocal patterns in young birds. If the neural architecture for this behavior was present in the theropod lineage before the evolution of birds, then the sleeping theropod might have been producing low, muffled versions of its waking calls throughout the night, a quiet, unconscious music rising from the sleeping body like heat. The large female's breathing is audible from where you stand at the edge of the clearing. It is not the rapid, shallow breathing of an animal in distress. It is the slow, measured rhythm of deep rest, a breath every several seconds, the ribs expanding with the intake and settling with the release. The exhalation carrying a barely audible sound, something between a sigh and a very faint vocalization, an almost musical remnant of a waking call processed down to its most essential form by the sleeping brain, in and out, long and slow, the enormous body receiving the night's work of repair and restoration one breath at a time. Around her the forest maintains its nighttime soundtrack, insects in the undergrowth, the slow drip of moisture condensed on leaves in the cooling air, each drop creating a tiny percussion event as it falls on the leaf below, a pattern of sound so fine and so continuous that it becomes a texture rather than a series of distinct events. The river, not visible from the clearing but audible as a background murmur that rises and falls with the slight shifts of the breeze. A night bird, one of the early avian dinosaurs, calling from somewhere in the upper canopy in a series of short, sharp notes that carry surprise information. Something has moved in the forest nearby, but not toward the clearing, and the alarm dissolves before it fully forms, the bird subsiding back into silence. This is, admittedly, speculation, but it is speculation rooted in real biology, in the known behavior of the living creatures that inherited the theropod lineage, and it paints a picture of the prehistoric night that is stranger and richer than any reconstruction that begins and ends with the roar. The roar belongs to a Tyrannosaurus that is awake and alarmed, and asserting its dominance over something that has triggered a response. But the night belongs to a different animal entirely, heavier, quieter, breathing slowly in the warm dark, perhaps murmuring to itself in the particular way of sleeping birds, perhaps simply lying in the ancient silence of a world that does not require it to be anything other than a body at rest. The forest around the resting Tyrannosaur is full of nighttime sound. The insects still sing, the frogs still call from the ponds and the river bends. Further away, the Hadrosaur herd on the floodplain is maintaining its low acoustic census, the slow exchange of presence confirmation calls that stitches the herd together through the dark. And the theropod in the forest clearing lies with its side rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep, and it is, for the duration of that rhythm, perhaps the least frightening thing in the world. A small mammal, one of the shrew-like animals that inhabit the forest floor in this era, moves along a root system not 15 meters from the sleeping Tyrannosaurus. It moves with the cautious speed of a creature whose entire evolutionary strategy is built around not being noticed by anything larger than itself, its tiny body navigating the complex terrain of roots and fallen debris with practiced ease. It passes within the ambient sensory field of the sleeping predator and continues on its way, not because the Tyrannosaurus has failed to register its presence, but because a sleeping animal's sensory threshold is calibrated to respond to meaningful stimuli and to ignore the irrelevant. The small mammal is not meaningful prey for this animal, and so it passes unmolested through the night, adding its own tiny contribution to the acoustic fabric of the Cretaceous dark. This is something worth sitting with for a moment. The most feared predator of its era, sleeping. The architecture of fear dissolved by exhaustion and metabolic necessity into simple animal rest. The body that hunts also breathing, also dreaming if the neurological capacity was there, also lying down at the end of the day and closing its eyes, also needing the night the way every living thing needs the night, as a period of repair and restoration, and the quiet renewal that only sleep can provide. The night makes equals of all living things in this way. The Tyrannosaurus and the small mammal in the branches above it, and the Hadrosaur on the floodplain and the insect in the undergrowth, and you, here, now, listening to all of it from the infinite patience of deep time, all of you doing the same thing, or trying to do the same thing. You're letting the night take you. You're consenting to the old agreement that the dark makes with every living thing, the agreement that has been honoured by every animal that has ever existed. Give me your wakefulness, and I will give you back the morning. The Tyrannosaurus honours it. The Hadrosaurs honour it. The ancient world honours it in every living body that lies down when the light fades and trusts the dark to return it, unchanged and renewed, to the light. And you, here, in the oldest night that this story can take you to, you are honouring it too. The night is patient. The morning is coming. All you need to do is let them both be what they are. The small mammals moving through the undergrowth near the sleeping Tyrannosaur share a night that is, in its acoustic texture, defined entirely by the presence of the great sleeping predator. Not because the Tyrannosaur's sleep is loud, it is not. It is quiet. Its breathing barely audible from more than a few meters, its occasional low sleep vocalizations muffled by the distance and the vegetation. But because the absence of other sounds in the immediate vicinity of the sleeping predator is itself meaningful, the insect chorus is slightly thinner here, slightly more sparse, as if even the insects have learned to give the large predator a degree of acoustic space. The frog calls from the nearby water are regular but not intense. The small mammals move through the area with slightly more deliberation and slightly less frequent vocalization than they would in a Tyrannosaur-free zone. The entire acoustic environment of the clearing has adjusted itself around the presence of the sleeping giant, creating a particular silence that is almost reverent, a quiet that is imposed not by the absence of sound, but by the restraint of everything living in the vicinity, all of it choosing, through evolutionary conditioning and immediate caution, to keep its own acoustic signature small in the presence of something so much larger. And yet the sleeping Tyrannosaur is not alarming. You have been standing at the edge of this clearing long enough to understand that. The most feared predator of the Cretaceous world is asleep on the ground, with its eyes closed and its great muscled body rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep rest. And what you feel in its presence is not fear, but something closer to wonder. The particular wonder of encountering something much larger than yourself in a state of perfect vulnerability. The wonder of being trusted by the mere fact of its sleep, with the knowledge that even the most powerful thing in the world needs to rest. The question of whether the Tyrannosaurus or any large theropod was capable of something we might call dreaming is one that cannot be answered from the fossil record, but that is not, given the neural evidence, entirely absurd to ask. Modern birds, which share with large theropods not just a common ancestor, but a remarkably direct line of descent in the case of the more derived Coelurosaurs, exhibit during sleep the rapid eye movements and the irregular respiratory patterns that in mammals are associated with the dreaming phase of sleep. The function of this dreaming equivalent phase in birds is debated, as it is in mammals, but it is present, and it is associated with the offline processing of recent experiences and the consolidation of learned behaviors. If the large theropods had a neural architecture sufficient to support a dreaming equivalent, the dreams they processed during the Cretaceous night would have been formed of everything the waking Tyrannosaurus had learned that day. The geography of the territory, the behavior of potential prey, the locations of water and suitable resting places, the movements and behaviors of other large theropods in the area. The sleeping brain processing this information, running through it offline without the demands of immediate environmental monitoring, would have been doing exactly what sleeping brains are supposed to do, exactly what your sleeping brain will do when you give it the dark and the quiet that it needs to do its work. The Tyrannosaurus is still sleeping in its clearing. You have been at the edge of this space long enough now that the forest around you has accepted your presence and resumed its ordinary business around you, the insects calling. A small mammal crossing the route that is 10 meters to your left, the distant river maintaining its conversation with its own banks somewhere beyond the trees. The sleeping predator breathes, in and out, the enormous lungs of an enormous body working at the pace of deep rest. Not the rapid, shallow breathing of exertion or arousal, but the full, measured, unhurried rhythm of an animal that has given its body over completely to the work of sleep. It is, if you allow yourself to see it clearly, one of the most peaceful images in the history of life on Earth. If you're drifting now, let yourself go deeper. You're safe here in the ancient dark. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. The night has more to show you whenever you are ready. Move forward now, from the deep Jurassic into the middle of the Cretaceous period, into a world that is transitioning in ways that will eventually matter enormously for the future of sound on Earth. The evolution of birds, those feathered theropod dinosaurs that took to the air and found in that new medium possibilities unavailable on the ground, was not a sudden event and not a simple one. It was a long, gradual, massively branching process that unfolded over tens of millions of years, and by the mid-Cretaceous, the world already held within it a significant diversity of early bird lineages, some of them resembling modern birds in many of their characteristics, others still carrying traces of their more obviously dinosaurian ancestry in their clawed wings and toothed beaks and long bony tails. Notice that the body is heavier than it was when this story began. That is normal. That is what happens when you stop holding yourself up against the world and let the world support you instead. The night is doing its work. The breath is slower now, or should be, and the thoughts that move through the mind have a different quality, a drift rather than a march. Let them drift. The story continues, and you do not need to hold it. It will hold itself, and you, and carry both of you gently through the ancient world toward the place where sleep is waiting. What the birds brought to the soundscape was something entirely new. Not the low resonant vibrations of the large dinosaurs, not the mechanical insect-like sounds of the ancient chorus, but something that inhabited the middle register with a complexity and a melody that the world had not heard before. The Syrinx, that remarkable double-throated instrument at the base of the bird's throat, allowed for a range and variability of sound production that the Crocodilians' simpler vocal anatomy could not match, and that the non-avian dinosaurs, whatever their acoustic capabilities were, did not appear to have possessed in the same form. And the evolution of the Syrinx opened up a sonic possibility space of almost limitless extent, a space that the bird lineages would spend the next 66 million years exploring with extraordinary thoroughness. The earliest birds did not sing the way modern songbirds sing. The complex, learned, culturally transmitted songs of the ocenpasserines, the finches and thrushes and warblers and nightingales and sparrows represent a relatively late development in bird evolutionary history, a flowering of acoustic complexity that belongs largely to the post-Cretaceous world. But the early Cretaceous birds were not silent, and the calls they produced were, even in those early lineages, shaped by the emerging complexity of the Syrinx into something with more modulation and more tonal range than the calls of their non-avian relatives. Archaeopteryx, the famous Jurassic Cretaceous transitional form whose fossils from the lithographic limestone of Bavaria have been studied for over a century and a half, was almost certainly a calling animal. Its brain, reconstructed from the natural endocast that the interior of its fossilized skull provides, shows enlargement of the auditory processing regions that in modern birds correlates with sophisticated sound production and detection. It was hearing things and responding to them with something more complex than simple, reflexive reactions. Whether those responses constituted anything we would recognize as birdsong in any modern sense is impossible to know, but the neural architecture for complex acoustic behavior was already present in that ancient form, laid down in the bones of the earliest birds like a blueprint for the extraordinary acoustic elaboration that was to come. Picture one of these early birds now, a creature perhaps the size of a large crow, perched high in the upper branches of a conifer somewhere in the mid-Cretaceous world. Its body is more compact than its dinosaurian ancestors, the long bony tail reduced over millions of years of evolution to the small bony stump that we call the pygostyle, which acts as an anchor for the tail feathers that now serve both as a flight surface and as a communication tool. Its wings are fully feathered and fully functional, shaped by the demands of flight into a form that is not identical to any modern bird, but that is recognizably, clearly, unmistakably a bird's wing. It sits with the compact, bundled posture of a roosting bird, its feathers slightly fluffed to trap warm air, its head slightly drawn down toward its shoulders, its eyes closed in the particular way of a bird that is asleep but not so deeply asleep that it would fail to wake at the approach of anything that mattered. As the Cretaceous deepened and the bird lineages diversified, the nighttime soundscape began to acquire layers that had not previously existed. Early owls and owl-like birds, adapted to low-light hunting, developed the large eyes and asymmetric ears that allow modern owls to locate prey in absolute darkness by sound alone, hunting by triangulation, using the slight difference in arrival time of a sound at the two differently positioned ears to pinpoint a mouse or a vole beneath leaf litter with extraordinary precision. These early nocturnal birds produced their calls in the night, not as hunting signals but as territorial and mating communications, and their calls would have had the same haunting resonance that their descendants produce today, the same quality of arriving in the dark from a direction that is difficult to identify, the same particular effect on the listening nervous system. There is something about an owl call in the dark that operates at a different level from most night sounds. The modern barn owl's call has been described by many cultures and many individual listeners as unearthly, as something that seems to come from outside the familiar dimensions of the natural world. Part of this impression comes from the extraordinary softness of owl flight, the near-total silence with which they move through the air, which means that the call seems to arrive without a source, detached from any moving body, coming from the dark as a pure acoustic event rather than as the output of a visible creature. Part of it comes from the particular frequencies involved, which occupy a range that the human auditory system processes differently from the normal background sounds of the environment, a range associated with alertness, but in a way that is more watchful than alarmed, more present than anxious. The early Cretaceous owls calling from their perches in the ancient conifers would have produced something very close to this effect. A sound that arrived from the darkness without visible source. A sound that was there and then was not there. A sound that occupied the upper portion of the night soundscape, the way a single sustained note on a flute or a piccolo occupies the upper register of an orchestral piece, not the most prominent element, not the foundation of the music, but the thing that gives the whole its particular quality of completeness. Below the owls, the night belonged to the familiar chorus, the insects and the frogs and the lower calls of the non-avian dinosaurs. But the owls gave the night its ceiling. They established the top of the acoustic register, and everything between their high, soft calls and the deep infrasonic vibrations of the large dinosaurs filled in the middle, creating a soundscape with a completeness, a fullness of frequency range that the earlier world had not possessed. There were also the early shorebirds and wading birds, the ancestors of the herons and egrets and bitterns that today occupy the wetland edges of the world, and these birds were producing calls that carried the penetrating, slightly melancholy quality that characterizes the calls of modern marsh birds at night. Stand at the edge of any wetland in the deep dark, and you will hear sounds that connect directly back to the mid-Cretaceous acoustic world. The booming of bitterns, the harsh calls of night herons, the low gabbling of waterfowl settling on dark water. These sounds have not changed much in 70 million years, because the ecological contexts that produced them have not changed much, and evolution, when something works, tends to leave it alone. The lakeshore is not far from where you stand. You can hear it. The sound of water in the reeds, the soft percussion of wavelets against the muddy bank, the occasional splash of a fish rising to the surface, and the brief disturbance it makes in the otherwise smooth, dark water. The early wading birds stand in the shallows with that particular stillness that makes wading birds look, even in motion, like they are practicing for motionlessness, their long legs invisible in the dark water, their long necks curved in the resting posture. One of them produces a sound, a low guttural note that begins deep in the chest and rises briefly before subsiding, a sound that is more felt than heard at this distance, and then there is silence again and the water sounds and the soft persistent calling of the night insects from the reed beds. The forest in the late Cretaceous night was acoustically rich in a way that the earlier Mesozoic world had not been. Every layer of vegetation had its own acoustic inhabitants. The canopy was the domain of the roosting pterosaurs and the larger early birds, their occasional calls and the sound of their movements carrying down through the darkness to the forest floor. The middle story was crossed by the nighttime flyers and occupied by the roosting small birds, their quiet contact calls weaving through the darkness like threads in a fabric. The understory held the insects and the small mammals and the earliest lizards, each producing their own characteristic sounds. And below all of it, coming up from the earth itself, the deep low calls of the dinosaurs. The sound of a Cretaceous forest at night, if you could hear the full spectrum of it, from the deep infrasonic vibrations of the large animals all the way up to the ultrasonic calls of the early bats and insectivorous mammals, would be something that no human being has ever heard. It would be the fullest expression of what biological sound production had achieved by the end of the Mesozoic. 180 million years of acoustic evolution compressed into a single night, a single place, a single moment of extraordinary biological richness. The fact that we cannot hear it, that it is gone as thoroughly as the animals that made it, is one of the genuine losses of the extinction event that ended the Mesozoic world. We have the bones, we have the footprints, we have the endocasts of the brains, but we do not have the sound, and perhaps that is the deepest silence that deep time has produced. You are in the middle of all of it, the high owl call above you, the insect song around you, the deep dinosaur vibration below you, the frog calls from the direction of the water, the soft rustle of something small moving through the leaf litter a short distance away. The gentle drip of last night's rain still finding its way from leaf to leaf, down through the canopy, each drop making a brief soft sound as it falls, a sound so short that it is gone before the auditory system has finished registering it, but adding its brief note to the general texture of the night. All of these sounds exist on a spectrum, from the deepest infrasound that you feel in the bones of your feet and the space between your ribs, to the highest calls of the small birds in the canopy that arrive at the edge of the audible range and seem to exist more as a brightness in the air than as a distinct sound. And across that entire spectrum, from its deepest bass to its highest treble, the message is the same message, not alarm, not danger, not the call to attention or the signal of threat. The message is simply that the world is going on, that life is proceeding, that the night is doing what nights do, holding the sleeping world in its dark and patient hands, and that everything within it is engaged in the ancient and universal business of rest and repair. There is nowhere to be but here. There is nothing to do but be present. The night is making its music without any assistance, has been making it for much longer than you can conceive of, and will continue making it long after this particular night is over. You're a guest in it, as you have always been a guest in the natural world, and the gift that the natural world offers to every guest who is still enough to receive it is simply this: the opportunity to rest inside the oldest and most complete music that life has ever made, the sound of everything alive and at peace in the ancient dark, the sound that has been playing since before any human ear existed to hear it, the sound that your body recognizes not with the mind but with something older and deeper and more fundamentally true. The earliest birds represent a threshold moment in the acoustic history of life, the moment when the complexity of sound production took a significant step toward what we recognize as song in the full modern sense. Before the birds, the world was full of sound, but the sounds were mostly functional. Territorial calls, contact calls, mating displays, alarm signals, complex melodic structure, the organization of sounds into sequences that have aesthetic as well as informational properties, that carry beauty as a secondary function alongside their primary biological purpose, that appears to be a relatively late development, emerging in the bird lineage as the Syrinx became capable of the kind of rapid, precise modulation that melody requires. The first truly melodic sounds in the history of Earth may have been produced by a dinosaur. That thought deserves a moment. The invention of melody, of organized, recurring, aesthetically structured sound, may have been a dinosaurian achievement. Not the specific melodies we know from the birds of our own world. Those came later, shaped by tens of millions of years of additional evolution and cultural transmission and the accumulation of learned vocal traditions passed from parent to offspring across uncountable generations. But the possibility of melody, the neural and physiological architecture required to produce and appreciate organized sound sequences that may have been present in the Cretaceous forests, produced for the first time by small feathered theropods perched in the upper branches of ancient conifers, filling the night with the first halting expressions of what would eventually become one of the most complex and beautiful phenomena in the natural world. There is a category of sounds called the acoustic signature, the unique combination of frequencies and timing patterns that allows an individual animal to be recognized by others of its species as a specific individual rather than as an anonymous member of the group. Human voices have acoustic signatures, birdsongs have them, the calls of many large mammals have them, and there is every reason to believe, based on the complexity of the vocal anatomy involved and the sophistication of the auditory processing regions in their brains, that the early birds of the Cretaceous had them too, that they knew each other's voices, that a parent bird could recognize the call of its own chick from among many chicks calling simultaneously, that mated pairs could find each other acoustically in dense forest without needing visual contact. This is a form of intimacy that the bones alone do not reveal. The fossils tell us about the anatomy. They tell us about the brain size and the neural organization. They suggest, through those anatomical facts, the capability for individual acoustic recognition. But the actual acoustic relationships between specific individuals, the particular recognition of one voice as known and valued and sought, that is lost with the sounds themselves. We cannot know whether the small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous experienced something analogous to the experience of hearing a familiar voice in the dark. The particular quality of recognition and comfort that comes from hearing someone you know, we cannot know. But the anatomy suggests the capacity was there, and the ecology suggests it would have been useful, and the biology of every living descendant of those animals suggests that it was real. Follow the water now down from the forested slopes toward the wide valley where the great Cretaceous rivers ran. Rivers have always been centers of life, attractors of everything that breathes and drinks and hunts and grows, and in the Mesozoic world the rivers were even more central to the distribution of life than they are today, in the warmer, wetter world of a period when the continent interiors were not yet the vast, semi-arid expanses of later geological ages. The rivers here are broader and slower and more heavily vegetated at their margins than modern rivers at the same latitude, and the life they support is denser and more varied. The river you are following now is broad and unhurried, somewhere in what will eventually become the interior of North America. It moves with the particular slow grace of a river that has a very long way to go and no reason to rush, that has all of geological time to make its way from the mountains to the sea, and is not interested in arriving early. Its water is warm, just above the temperature of the air that hangs over it on this particular night, so that in the cooler hours before dawn a faint mist rises from its surface and drifts downstream, catching what little light is available and giving the river a ghostly luminescence that has no visible source. The banks are low and heavily vegetated, fringed with enormous horsetails and stands of tree ferns that rise several meters above the waterline and catch the starlight on their glossy fronds. The river has its own sound, as rivers always do, a constant low music of water moving over the uneven riverbed, of current pressing around the roots of large trees that have fallen partly into the water, of the particular hollow sound that water makes when it moves over a flat stone at the right depth and speed. It is a sound that is, in the deep neurology of the human nervous system, among the most reliably calming sounds that exist, because it combines the white noise properties of broadband sound with a rhythmic quality that is close enough to regular to be soothing, but irregular enough to avoid the anxiety that true mechanical regularity can sometimes produce. Let the river do what rivers do. You do not need to follow its logic or understand its path. You only need to be here beside it, listening to the sound it makes as it passes. That sound has been passing for longer than any human civilization, longer than any human species, longer than anything that could be called human in any sense you would recognize. The water that makes this sound tonight has been water since the beginning of this planet, has been cycling through the atmosphere and the oceans and the ground and the living bodies of everything that has ever lived since before the dinosaurs themselves existed. It is very old water, and the sound it makes tonight is a very old sound, and it knows, in whatever way water knows anything, how to carry you towards sleep. The first large shape that moves in the water is not immediately distinguishable from a large log. It is long and low and barely seems to disturb the surface as it glides from one bank toward the centre of the river. But logs do not change direction with the subtle, decisive intention of something that is choosing its course rather than merely following the current. The large crocodilian that has been sharing this river with the Hadrosaur herd for years is performing its nightly assessment of its territory, moving slowly from the shallows toward the deeper channel, where it will float for an hour or more before returning to its favoured sandbar. The sounds the crocodilian makes are almost entirely below the water's surface tonight, a series of infrasonic vibrations broadcast through the medium that carries them most efficiently. In the air, there is nothing to hear from it. But in the water, it is communicating constantly, broadcasting its presence and its status to any other crocodilian within a considerable radius. The messages are territorial, the deep grammar of an animal species that has been using this particular language for more than 200 million years and has no need to update or improve it. The crocodilian lineage is perhaps the most eloquent evidence we have for the acoustic properties of the ancient world, not because crocodilians are identical to Mesozoic reptiles, but because their essential structure has changed so little since the Mesozoic that studying them is as close as we can come to studying the acoustic biology of their ancient relatives. Modern crocodiles and alligators produce calls that span an extraordinary range of frequencies and behavioural contexts, from the infrasonic vibrations of territorial advertisement that travel through both water and earth to the surprisingly complex parental vocalizations that female crocodilians produce when responding to the calls of their hatching young. These are not simple animals acoustically, they are old animals, and their complexity is the complexity of something that has been refined and elaborated over an enormous depth of time. At the river's edge, a group of hadrosaurs has come down to drink, moving from the floodplain where most of the herd rests toward the water in a small group, the largest adults flanking the younger animals in a protective formation that reflects millions of years of evolved social behaviour. They wade into the shallows without hesitation, their massive bodies displacing water without drama, their movements confident and unhurried. The crocodilian is aware of the hadrosaurs. The hadrosaurs are aware of the crocodilian. There is a mutual acknowledgement in their behaviour that is not fear on either side, not exactly, but something more like the practical recognition of shared territory, and the implicit agreement that interaction between them would be more costly than the benefit it would produce. The hadrosaurs drink with the slow, deliberate movements of animals that are not afraid but are not careless either. The largest ones stand in the deeper water, their great bulk barely registering the current that would knock a human being off their feet. The younger ones stay in the shallows, drinking with the characteristic head-lowering and head-raising rhythm of large herbivores at water, a motion that is beautiful in its simplicity and its repetition. The head going down into the water and coming up with the soft sound of water draining from the sides of a large face and running back into the river in small temporary streams. The low calls that the hadrosaurs exchange at the water's edge are quieter than the full-volume contact calls they produce on the open floodplain, as if the proximity of the water itself modulates their communication, as if drinking is a context that calls for a lower register. The calls drift across the water surface and are reflected back from the far bank, creating a faint echo that arrives a second after the original call, deepened and slightly altered by the passage over the water, a ghost of a sound that dissolves into the river's own constant note. Around the drinking hadrosaurs, the river's edge is alive with smaller creatures. Small early lizards hunt insects at the waterline, moving with the quick, decisive movements of ectotherms on warm nights, when their body temperature is high enough to support rapid activity. Protofrogs call from the root systems of riverside plants, their calls mixing with the constant background sound of the river in a way that makes the river seem to speak with a more complex voice than any single sound could produce. A large wading bird has landed on a gravel bank midstream and is fishing, standing with the extraordinary stillness of a creature that has evolved patience as a primary hunting strategy. The small mammals are here too, moving through the undergrowth with the nervous quickness of animals that know themselves to be potential prey and conduct their lives accordingly. They are mostly silent. Silence, for them, is not a choice but a survival strategy. The acoustic invisibility of small animals navigating a world full of things that would find them interesting if they made themselves known. But occasionally one will produce a brief high-frequency squeak, a sound so short and so high that it is almost outside the range of human hearing, passing through the acoustic environment without attracting the attention of anything whose hearing is tuned to lower frequencies. The relationship between these small mammals and the nighttime world is interesting and worth pausing on, because those small mammals are over the next 66 million years going to become us. The lineage that leads to every human being who has ever lived passes through the tiny, shrew-like nocturnal insectivores that move through the undergrowth and the lower branches of the Mesozoic forests, keeping silent and keeping to the shadows and surviving through the most dangerous period in the history of vertebrate life by being small and quick and acoustically invisible. When you listen to the sounds of the prehistoric night from the particular vantage point of a human body lying still in the dark, you're engaging with those sounds through a nervous system that was shaped, in part, by the experience of those animals, by the long education of the mammalian lineage in the acoustic ecology of the Mesozoic world. The mist on the river thickens as the night deepens toward its coldest point, the hour before dawn when the accumulated heat of the day is fully dissipated and the air is at its minimum temperature. The mist catches the faint starlight and diffuses it, making the river a ghostly presence in the dark landscape, visible not as a specific thing, but as a region where the edges of objects are less defined than they are on solid ground, where the boundary between water and air and mist seems to shift and breathe with the slight movements of the night air. The hadrosaurs have finished drinking and drifted back from the shallows toward the grassy bank, where they stand in the comfortable proximity of animals that have been together long enough to find the presence of each other's bodies simply the normal state of things. Their calls are quiet now, occasional, and brief, the residual communication of animals that are moving from the alertness required for eating and drinking back toward the deeper relaxation of full rest. The river moves on, carrying its sounds with it downstream, exchanging them for new sounds as new sections of bank present themselves, as new creatures drink and move and call in the dark. Time is moving differently now, in the way that time moves when the body is approaching sleep. The intervals between one moment and the next are longer. The details that would occupy a waking mind, the specific identity of each sound, the exact position of each shape in the dark, the analytical work of understanding and categorizing what you perceive, these are receding. What remains is simpler: the sound of water, the smell of growth and mud, and the faint mineral sharpness of a river in a warm climate, the soft calls of large animals nearby, the insect song, the mist, the dark. These things do not require understanding, they only require presence, and presence, it turns out, is the first step on the path to sleep. You are at the water's edge, and the sound of the river is doing what moving water has always done to the human nervous system. It is slowing things down, not by force, not by any active mechanism, but by simple presence, by the constant, gentle, perfectly irregular sound of water that has been moving for longer than you have existed and will continue moving long after you are gone, sound that belongs to no one and is addressed to no one, and carries no information that requires a response, sound that is simply there, as water is simply there, as the night is simply there, as old and as patient and as perfectly indifferent to your individual concerns as the river itself. The river at night is a teacher, if you are willing to sit with it long enough. What it teaches is patience, in the only way that patience can actually be taught, which is by demonstration. The river does not hurry. The river does not have opinions about whether it has been moving long enough or whether it might be moving more efficiently by a different route. The river is simply moving, has always been moving, will always be moving, and the particular stretch of it that you are watching right now will look like this, will sound like this, with minor variations, for as long as this landscape continues to exist in anything like its current form. The river is beyond impatience. It does not know what impatience is, and spending time with something that does not know what impatience is has a particular effect on the nervous system, which does know what impatience is and has been practicing it all day. Let the river teach you now. Let the sound of it reach you, not as background noise to be filtered out, but as instruction, as information about a way of being in time that your nervous system is capable of but rarely practices. The river moves at exactly the right speed. The night is exactly the right length. The distance between where you are now and where sleep is waiting is exactly the right distance, and you are closing it, moment by moment, with every breath you take that is slower than the last, with every thought that passes through the mind and is not pursued, with every sound that reaches you and is received without analysis, simply heard, simply present, simply part of the ancient acoustic world that has always known and still knows exactly what the night is for. The river is old. Not this particular river, which is a temporary feature of a landscape that will change enormously in the next few million years as the inland sea recedes and the continent reshapes itself under the slow pressure of tectonic movement. But the concept of the river, the gathering of water into a channel that flows downhill toward a larger body of water, that is old enough to predate the dinosaurs by a significant margin. Rivers have been flowing since the planet had both liquid water and land, and the sounds they make have been part of the acoustic environment of every terrestrial animal that has ever lived near one. The sound of moving water is one of the oldest environmental sounds that any vertebrate nervous system has ever needed to process, and the particular effect it has on the human brain, the calming, the grounding, the gentle reduction in the activity of the nervous system's vigilance circuits, is not accidental, but is the product of a very long evolutionary history of associating the sound of moving water with the proximity of a reliable resource in a safe landscape. Every time you have felt calmer near the sound of water, you have been responding with a nervous system that was shaped by hundreds of millions of years of that association. The river beside which the hadrosaurs drink in the Cretaceous night is not your river, but your response to it is real. The evolutionary history that produced your response to the sound of water is the same evolutionary history that made the hadrosaurs gather at the river in the evening, that made the crocodilians choose the river as their home, that made every vertebrate since the Devonian orient toward the sound of moving water as toward something familiar and safe. You are, in your response to this sound, in company with every animal that has ever lived near a river and found in its sound something that the open land does not offer. The particular calm of a reliable resource, a known and familiar acoustic landmark in the potentially dangerous landscape of the night. Not all dinosaurs were large. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but it runs counter to the dominant image that the word dinosaur produces in the mind, the image of vast creatures whose footsteps shook the ground and whose shadows fell across entire landscapes. The truth is that the dinosaur lineage produced, across its 170 million years of ecological dominance, creatures of every size, from the enormous sauropods to animals no larger than a pigeon or a crow, and the smaller members of that lineage were in many ways as ecologically significant and as biologically interesting as the large ones. The small dinosaurs lived everywhere, in the undergrowth and in the trees and in the crevices of rock faces and in the leaf litter of the forest floor, and they were awake through the night in numbers that the large animals were not, their size and their metabolism and their particular evolutionary inheritance making the night a more accessible domain for them than for the slow giants of the open floodplains. Among the most ecologically important and biologically interesting of the smaller dinosaurs were the small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous, the dromaeosaurids and troodontids and various early bird relatives whose fossilized remains, including in some remarkable cases preserved feathers and even traces of soft tissue coloration, have revolutionized our understanding of what the dinosaur world actually looked like. These were not the grey-green lizard-like creatures of older popular illustration. Many of them were covered in complex feathers, some iridescent, some banded in multiple colours, some with elaborate display plumes or fan-like tail structures. They were by any reasonable measure beautiful, and they were, based on the evidence of their neural architecture and their behaviour, acoustically sophisticated in ways that the larger and more famous dinosaurs were not. Imagine a group of them now roosting in the middle branches of a large conifer, their feathered bodies packed together in the tight companionable cluster of roosting birds, each individual's warmth contributing to the warmth of the whole, each individual's vigilance offset by the vigilance of all the others, so that the total system of the roost is more alert than any individual could be alone. Their feathers are visible in the thin starlight as a complex texture, the individual feathers overlapping in the precise engineered pattern that makes the feather coat of any bird both aerodynamically efficient and thermally effective, a structure of extraordinary elegance that evolution arrived at over millions of years of trial and selection and has seen no reason to significantly revise since. The troodon, or the animals grouped under that name in the older literature, were among the most cognitively complex of the non-avian theropods. Their brain-to-body ratios were, by dinosaur standards, very large, comparable to those of modern birds rather than to those of more ancient reptiles. The enlarged optic lobes and the substantial auditory processing regions visible in their brain endocasts suggest animals for whom hearing was as important as vision in the construction of their understanding of the world. An animal that processed sound with a brain of this sophistication could do more with sound than simply receive alarm signals. It could build social relationships through sound, could learn the individual voices of known individuals and respond differently to strangers, could use vocalization to communicate something more nuanced than simple, reflexive states. Groups of small feathered theropods resting in the undergrowth at night, communicating with the soft, low calls that birds use to maintain contact in roosts, would have added their particular register to the nighttime symphony. Higher than the Hadrosaur calls, lower than the insect song, occupying the frequency range that is, in the modern world, the domain of the smaller birds and the domain of voices in quiet conversation. There is something about sound in that register that the human brain responds to differently from the sounds above it and below it. The Hadrosaur's low vibration produces calm. The middle register of bird-like calls produces something closer to the feeling of being in familiar company, the acoustic sense of being surrounded by living things that are not alarmed and not alarming, that are simply present in the way that good company is present, without demands and without urgency. The nesting behaviour of small theropods is attested in the fossil record from some remarkable discoveries that have shifted the understanding of dinosaur parental behaviour significantly in recent decades. The oviraptorid dinosaurs in particular have been found in fossilised brooding positions over nests, their bodies arranged in the characteristic spread-winged posture of a bird incubating eggs, their arms extended low and wide to provide maximum coverage for the nest below. These animals were not simply dumping their eggs in a sandy depression and walking away, as reptiles are often assumed to do. They were sitting on their nests, protecting their eggs with their bodies, providing warmth and shade and the physical barrier of their presence between the eggs and the world. The call of a brooding dinosaur to its eggs, or to the hatchling young emerging from those eggs, would have been among the most intimate sounds of the prehistoric world, a sound directed at a very specific audience of 1 or 2 or 3, a sound so close and so quiet that it would have been inaudible from any significant distance. There is no fossil record of such a call. There cannot be. But the biology of the modern birds that inherited this behaviour from the theropod lineage allows us to imagine it. Low, very soft, produced with the beak partly closed, a vibration more than a sound, directed downward toward the warm eggs beneath the parent's body. This is one of the most affecting images that the science of prehistoric acoustics produces, if you allow yourself to sit with it. A feathered dinosaur somewhere in the warm dark of the Cretaceous night, lying over its nest with its body spread and its eyes half closed against the night, speaking very quietly to the eggs beneath it. Not the sound of violence or dominance or the dramatic confrontation of predator and prey. Not even the social contact calls of the herd. Something smaller and closer and more essential than any of those, the sound of a parent waiting, the sound of something alive and warm communicating, in the most fundamental possible way, across the fragile boundary between the already living and the not yet born. The hatchlings, breaking out of their eggs into the warm space beneath the parent's body, would have heard that call as the first sound of their lives. Before light, before cold, before hunger, before any other input from the world outside the egg, they would have heard the parent's low vibration, the particular pattern of that individual voice, and it would have become for them the sound of safety, the sound of being cared for, the sound of everything that the world needed to be and was. How different is that, really, from the function that a parent's voice serves in the life of any other young animal, including human young? The specific frequencies and the specific structures are different, but the function is identical. There is a broader truth here worth pausing on. The function of parental vocalization, of the reassuring call that says, "I am here, you are safe, the world is being managed," has not changed since the Cretaceous. It may not have changed since the first vertebrate that cared for its young used its voice to communicate something to those young about the nature of the world. The particular sounds change, the mechanisms change, the neural pathways that produce them and receive them change. But the fundamental transaction, the acoustic delivery of safety and care from one living being to another, that does not change. You are part of an unbroken chain of animals that have been receiving that kind of communication since the Mesozoic. Your nervous system was built by evolution to receive it and to respond to it with calm. The sound of something large and calm speaking quietly in the dark near you is one of the oldest safety signals that the mammalian nervous system knows. In the night around the small theropod roost, the world is doing what it always does. the insect song continuing without pause, the river at some distance making its own patient sound, the stars turning overhead with that silent, perfect, endlessly patient precision that the stars have been practicing since long before any eye opened to watch them. The small feathered theropods in the undergrowth are becoming quiet now, their contact calls growing less frequent, the intervals between them longer, the calls themselves shorter and softer as sleep settles over the roost with the gradual inevitability of warmth. A single individual in the roost produces a call that is slightly different from the contact calls that have been exchanging through the group since full dark. It is lower and slower, not the brief confirmatory note of a contact call, but something more sustained, more melodic in its simple way, something that rises and falls through a small range of pitches over the course of several seconds, before ending on a note that is softer than the one it began on. It sounds, if you can be forgiven the anthropomorphism, exactly like a lullaby. Not a human lullaby, not a composed or intentional thing, but a biological lullaby. A sound that the animal's nervous system produces when it is in a specific state of relaxation and safety, a sound that communicates that state to every other nervous system that receives it, that says not just I am here, but I am at rest, and being at rest is right, and rest is what this moment calls for. The last call of the roost is barely audible. It is a single note, very brief, the kind of sound that might be produced by a small bird settling more deeply into its resting posture, a sound that is less a deliberate communication than an exhalation, the acoustic trace of a body releasing its last held tension before sleep. And then nothing but the background sounds of the world, and the slow, barely perceptible breathing of small warm bodies at rest, breathing together in the way that roosting birds breathe together, in the faint synchrony that comes from long familiarity and from the simple comfort of being close. You're small in this landscape, small and warm and held in the great dark of the ancient world without any requirement to do anything at all. The enormous concerns of the large creatures moving through the dark elsewhere in the Cretaceous night are not your concerns. The hunting and the defending and the long patient business of being very large and requiring a great deal of food and territory and space, none of that belongs to the small warm being that you are in this moment. Your concern is only this: the warmth of the night air, the sound of the world doing its ancient business without you, and the knowledge carried so deep in the body that it requires no articulation, that sleep is the oldest right of every living thing, and that you have done nothing to forfeit yours. The breath slows. The thoughts that were moving through the mind like the light traffic of a quiet road grow further apart and less distinct. The sounds of the Cretaceous night are all around you still, but they have shifted in character, the way sounds shift when the listening changes, when the analytical attention relaxes and what remains is not understanding but simply presence, the pure acoustic event received without interpretation, sound as sensation rather than sound as information. This is the threshold. You're very close to it. The small feathered bodies in the roost are asleep, their breathing slow and their feathers fluffed against the cooling air, their dreams if they have them moving through neural pathways that share ancient architecture with your own. They are asleep, and the night is gentle, and there is nothing left to do. The feathers of the small theropods in the roost are visible in the thin starlight as a complex texture, and it is worth pausing on the feathers for a moment, because the feathers are part of the story of dinosaur sound in a way that is not immediately obvious. Feathers are acoustically a remarkably effective insulating material. They trap air in the spaces between the interlocking barbules, and air trapped in small spaces has excellent sound-absorbing properties. A feathered animal is, all else being equal, a quieter animal in the sense that its own movements produce less sound, that the rustling of its feathers in motion is softer and more diffuse than the equivalent rustling of scales. The evolution of feathers, which preceded the evolution of flight in the theropod lineage, and may have served primarily thermal and display functions before it served aerodynamic ones, also had the secondary effect of making the small feathered theropods quieter in their movements, and quietness in movement is itself a form of acoustic communication, a way of saying to the environment, I am small, I am cautious, I am not something that needs to be tracked by the large and the predatory. This acoustic quietness of the feathered dinosaurs in the roost, the soft quality of their sounds compared to the deep vibrations of the large animals elsewhere in the landscape, gives the roost scene a particular character. It is the quietest part of the prehistoric night, the part where the soundscape has retreated from the large and the low to the small and the intimate, and that intimacy is itself a form of comfort, a reminder that the Mesozoic world was not entirely composed of enormous dramas played out at the scale of the landscape, but was also in the branches of its trees and the undergrowth of its forests, full of small, warm, social creatures finding each other in the dark and communicating their aliveness to each other in the gentlest possible registers. The evolutionary pressure that produced the close roosting behaviour of small feathered theropods was the same pressure that produces it in modern roosting birds: thermal efficiency and collective vigilance. In small-bodied endotherms, the maintenance of body temperature against the cooling of the night is metabolically expensive, and any reduction in the thermal gradient between the body and the surrounding air reduces that expense. Bodies pressed together, sharing warmth, reduce the effective thermal gradient for each individual in the roost. A group of 10 small birds roosting in physical contact with each other conserves heat far more efficiently than 10 individuals roosting separately, and the metabolic savings are real and measurable and translate directly into survival advantage over the long run of evolutionary time. This is why roosting birds roost close together, not for sentiment, for thermodynamics. But the thermodynamic explanation is not the whole story, and the other part of the story is the one that connects most directly to your own experience of this moment. The close physical contact of the roost also produces the calming effects of social touch, the reduction in stress hormones and the increase in affiliative neurochemical states that physical proximity to known individuals produces in social animals. These effects are not uniquely mammalian. They are present in birds and are likely present in some form in any social animal that maintains physical contact with group members. The small feathered theropods in the roost, pressed together for warmth and perhaps for something beyond warmth, were experiencing something that the word comfort is not too anthropomorphic to approximate. The warmth and the quiet and the pressure of known bodies nearby and the soft sounds of sleeping breath, these are not complicated experiences. They are very old experiences. And the nervous system that finds them settling, the body that responds to them by releasing its held tensions and allowing itself to rest, that nervous system is not yours alone. It is the nervous system of every social animal that has ever lived in a group and slept close to others. It is very old. It knows exactly what to do. There is a particular quality to the hour before dawn, in every era and every landscape, that is unlike any other hour of the day or night. It is not quite darkness and not quite light. It is the threshold between the two states, a transitional space that exists in every creature's experience as the moment when the long commitment to rest begins its slow negotiation with the returning world, when the body begins its own quiet preparations for the demands of the day without yet abandoning the particular piece of sleep. In the Cretaceous world, as in every world before and after it, this hour was marked by a shift in the soundscape that any sleeping creature could feel in its sleep without waking, a change in the acoustic texture of the night that registered in the sleeping brain as information rather than alarm. The insect chorus begins to change first. This is how it always begins with the insects, because insects are the most purely metabolic of acoustic animals, their calling driven directly by body temperature, in a relationship that has no cognitive mediation, no decision involved, only the automatic response of chemical processes to thermal conditions. The species that sing in the deepest night are the cold-tolerant ones, the ones that can operate at the lowest temperatures the night produces, and as the last pre-dawn hour reaches the minimum of the overnight temperature curve, their calling grows less frequent. The intervals between calls grow longer, the voices grow thinner. Other species tune to slightly warmer conditions and to the particular quality of the air at the cusp of darkness and light, begin to replace them, producing slightly different calls at slightly different frequencies, creating a subtle but perceptible shift in the texture of the sound. The frogs at the river's edge modify their calls too, though they are the last of the main nighttime chorus to begin the transition. The nightly frog chorus has reached its peak volume somewhere in the middle hours, when the darkness was most complete and the humidity was highest, and the competitive pressure to be heard among many competing voices was at its maximum. Since then it has been declining gradually, almost imperceptibly, individual frogs withdrawing from the chorus as some threshold in their own physiology was reached, the acoustic competition resolved for another night, the urge to call satisfied. By the last hour before dawn, the frog calls are isolated events rather than overlapping chorus, occasional voices in a landscape that has grown quiet enough that each call can be heard distinctly against the background. This is the quietest hour. You should know that. The hour before dawn is, in any natural landscape, the hour when the night's chorus has wound down and the morning's chorus has not yet begun, and the world is at its most genuinely quiet, the background level of natural sound at its minimum. The night birds are finishing their last calls, the active nocturnal insects have slowed, the large animals are in their deepest sleep, and into that particular quiet, if you are awake to receive it, there falls a quality of silence that is unlike any other silence, a silence that is not empty but is full of the just finished night and the not yet begun morning, a silence that has weight and texture, and that seems to hold everything that has passed through it suspended in a kind of timeless pause. The Hadrosaur herd on the floodplain begins to stir, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the cumulative way that large groups of animals transition from rest to wakefulness, with individuals shifting their weight and changing position, and making the brief low calls that confirm their continued presence in the herd after the long hours of relative stillness. The calls are slightly different from the deep night calls, slightly higher in pitch and slightly more frequent, carrying a quality of renewed alertness that reflects the shift in the herd's collective nervous system as the sleeping brain re-engages with the waking world. The herd is coming back to itself slowly, the way all large things come back to themselves slowly with a dignity appropriate to their size. The large carnivores, if they have been resting through the night, are reaching the lighter stages of sleep in this hour. The Tyrannosaurus in its forest clearing makes a slow movement, its massive tail shifting position with a sound that carries a short distance through the undergrowth. The metabolic processes that the deep hours of rest have been serving are completing their work. The body is preparing itself, in the particular way that sleeping bodies prepare themselves, for the return of daylight and the demands it brings. This preparation is not conscious. It does not involve a decision or an intention. It is simply the body doing what it has always done at this hour, following the ancient instruction that is built into every living organism, the instruction that says, "The night is ending, begin the slow return." The pterosaurs high in the canopy are already awake, or nearly awake, stretching their extraordinary wings in the first preliminary way of animals preparing for flight, unfurling the membranes that in the full extension of flight span meters of air, testing the joints and the tendons that will be required as soon as the air above the canopy is warm enough to generate the thermals they prefer. A few have launched already, the sound of their wing beats briefly audible as they clear the canopy and find the slightly warmer upper air, where they will begin the long gliding circuits that are their preferred mode of travel in the early morning, before the day's heat has built the strong thermals of the afternoon. In the undergrowth, the small feathered theropods are waking with the sudden, decisive alertness of small animals that cannot afford the gradual transition between sleep and wakefulness that large animals can manage. One moment they are still, the next they are moving, making their contact calls, re-establishing the social fabric of the roost group after the long silence of sleep. Their calls are quick and frequent now, a rapid acoustic sensors of the group, answered from branch to branch and from one patch of undergrowth to another as each individual confirms its presence and its condition. The roost is intact, everyone is accounted for, the night has been survived. Far to the east, at the edge of the forest where the floodplain begins, the first grey light is appearing above the tree line. It is not yet light in any functional sense. It is simply a reduction in the quality of the darkness, a distinction beginning to emerge between the sky and the silhouettes of the tallest trees, a barely perceptible layering of dark shades that will, over the next 20 minutes, slowly differentiate into something recognizable as the first light of a new Cretaceous day. The animals of this world do not wait for it to be fully light before beginning their response. The transition has been coming for hours, carried in the changing temperature and the changing acoustic environment and the changing smells of the air as the night's humidity begins to lift. And by the time the first actual photons of visible light reach their eyes, many of them are already well into the behavioral states of daytime. The first bird call of the dawn is not a bird call as you would recognize it from any modern morning, because the birds of the mid-Cretaceous are not the birds of your time, and the songs they sing are not the full complex learned songs of the modern dawn chorus. But it is a call. It is the first call. A brief descending note that is repeated twice and then falls silent, produced by one of the early avian dinosaurs roosting in the upper canopy, a small creature whose identity we cannot know with certainty, but whose call is the beginning of something that will, in 65 million years, become the dawn chorus of the modern world. The first morning bird call since the world began. Here, in the Cretaceous, it is tentative, it is simple, but it is there. More calls follow, from different species and different individuals, the early birds of the Cretaceous dawn adding their voices to the insect chorus, and the frog calls and the Hadrosaur contact calls from the floodplain, the layers of the soundscape reorganizing themselves around the new quality of the hour. Everything is the same, in one sense, the same species, the same place, the same landscape. But the sounds are differently arranged, differently proportioned, the balance between the low and the high shifting as the animals of the day begin to assert their presence, and the animals of the night begin to withdraw from theirs. You have been in the night for a long time now, longer than any ordinary night lasts, moving through the deep hours of the Mesozoic dark and listening to the sounds that most human beings have never heard and will never hear. The Parasaurolophus calling across the dark floodplain, the sauropods in the Jurassic forest, the insect chorus older than any dinosaur, the river making its patient sound at the edge of the sleeping world, the small feathered dinosaurs in their roost, quiet as leaves in the deep hours. All of it has been working on you the way the night always works on those who stay with it long enough, loosening the grip of the day, releasing the held patterns of wakefulness one by one, replacing them with the deeper and more fundamental patterns of rest. The last hour before dawn is the hour of the deepest sleep. The body knows this the way it knows many things, without language and without reasoning, through the ancient biochemistry of the circadian rhythm that has been regulating the sleep and wakefulness of living things since long before vertebrates existed. The hormone cycles of the sleeping brain reach their deepest point in this hour. The consolidation of memory that sleep performs reaches its most critical phase. The physical repair processes that rest enables have had the entire night to work, and are completing their most important operations. The last hour before dawn is, in the biochemistry of the sleeping body, the gift that the whole night has been building toward, the point to which every earlier hour has been the preparation. The ancient world is giving you that gift now. The Cretaceous night has been long and deep and full of sound, and it has brought you to this threshold, this last hour, this place where the darkness is still nearly complete, but already carries within it the subtle signs of the approaching light. You do not need to stay awake for it. You do not need to witness the dawn. The dawn will happen whether you see it or not, has been happening every morning for 4.5 billion years, will happen again tomorrow and the morning after that, without any assistance from you or any awareness of your presence. Let it come without you. Let the Cretaceous dawn find you already deep in the sleep that the night prepared, already past the place where sound or light or the gentle stirring of the waking world can reach you. The breath slows, in and out, the chest rises and falls, the sound of the Cretaceous morning, the first birds and the receding insects and the low patient voice of the Hadrosaur heard, finding itself again in the returning light. All of that is present. All of that is part of the world you are in, and none of it requires anything from you. You can be here and asleep simultaneously. The world does not require your attention to proceed. It has always proceeded without it, will always proceed without it. And the gift that this knowledge offers, if you allow yourself to receive it, is the gift of genuine release, the permission to stop watching, stop tracking, stop maintaining the vigilant relationship with the world that wakefulness demands. The night has made its case. The ancient sounds have done their work, and what remains is simply this: the breath, the dark, the low familiar music of the world, and the oldest, most reliable rest that life has ever known. The specific neurochemistry of the last hour before dawn is worth noting, not because it requires understanding, but because knowing it is happening might, paradoxically, make it easier to allow it to happen. The brain, in the last hour before its natural waking time, is in the process of reducing its production of sleep-promoting substances and increasing its production of waking substances, but this process is gradual and it is reversible. The transition is a negotiation, not a declaration, and the conditions of the environment play a significant role in how the negotiation proceeds. A dark, quiet, warm environment signals to the transitioning brain that the conditions for continued sleep are favourable, and the brain, being an adaptive and responsive organ, adjusts accordingly. the preparation for waking slows. The window of deep sleep, the most restorative phase, extends. You do not need to do anything to make this happen. You only need to not interrupt it, to let the darkness and the quiet and the warmth of wherever you are signal to the negotiating brain that there is no reason to hurry toward the day. The Cretaceous night makes the same argument in its own vocabulary. The darkness is still nearly complete. The sounds are still the sounds of rest rather than the sounds of activity. The air is still warm, the warmth that has been accumulating in the soil and the vegetation and the shallow water since yesterday's sun reached it, still releasing slowly into the night air, the way any warmed thing releases its heat slowly and gradually, not all at once. There is no urgency here. The world is not demanding anything of you. The ancient night, which has been doing this since long before you existed, knows that the last hour before dawn is for sleeping, and has arranged everything accordingly. The Cretaceous morning, when it comes, will be extraordinary. The particular quality of early light in a world with no particulate pollution in the upper atmosphere, where the only dust and smoke in the air are what the planet's own geology produces, gives the dawn a clarity and a sharpness that the modern dawn, filtered through 2 centuries of industrial output, does not quite manage. The first light in that Cretaceous sky is blue and extremely clear, a blue of a specific quality that the artists of ancient civilizations tried to capture, and that the modern world has largely lost access to, except in certain high-altitude or remote environments. The colours of the Cretaceous dawn, if you were awake to see them, would be the most beautiful version of a sunrise that the human visual system has ever had the opportunity to process. But you will not see them. Not tonight. Tonight you are somewhere better than the dawn. Somewhere deeper than the dawn's possibility. You are in the hour before the dawn, in the deepest sleep of the ancient night, and the beautiful morning can wait for you, as all mornings wait, with the perfect patience of a morning that is not trying to arrive but simply arriving in its own time, as it always has. There are stories that require an ending, and the story of what dinosaurs sounded like at night has one. It is not the ending that any of the creatures in this story would have chosen, and it is not the kind of ending that arrives with warning or with gradual preparation. It arrived on a morning somewhere between 65 and 66 million years ago, as a light in the sky that grew brighter and brighter and faster until the entire eastern horizon was filled with it. A light that was not the sun, that arrived from the wrong direction and travelled at the wrong speed, and carried in its passage through the upper atmosphere a sonic event so enormous that the word sound no longer quite applies to it. The Chicxulub impactor, the asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula at the end of the Cretaceous period, was approximately 12 kilometres in diameter. It struck the Earth at a speed somewhere around 20 kilometres per second, which means it traversed a distance equal to the diameter of the Earth in about 10 minutes. The energy released by the impact was equivalent to roughly 100 million megatons of TNT, a number that is entirely without meaning to the human brain, which has no framework for holding such quantities of energy. In the immediate region of the impact, the distinction between sound and pressure wave and physical destruction became irrelevant, because all three were the same thing, and the shock wave that propagated outward from the impact site was the loudest single event in the history of life on Earth. But this is not where this story wants to dwell. The violence of the impact is not what this story is about. What this story is about is what came before it. The long, patient, endlessly varied acoustic world of the Mesozoic, and what came after it, the remarkable persistence of life and of sound through an event that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended both. Because life persisted. Sound persisted. The world was not silenced by the impact, though it was profoundly changed. The silence, if it can be called a silence, was temporary, measured not in the individual timescales of lives and generations, but in the geological timescales of thousands and tens of thousands of years, timescales that are truly long in human terms but brief in the life of the planet. Let that perspective settle into you. Even the greatest extinction event in the history of vertebrate life, the event that ended the Mesozoic era and took with it 75% of all species then living on Earth, was temporary in geological terms. The planet recovered. Life recovered. Sound recovered. Nothing that the Earth has experienced in 4.5 billion years of existence has managed to silence it permanently, and the fact that you are here, right now, in this particular body with these particular ears, is the proof of that resilience, the embodied evidence that life finds ways, that the night always returns, that the sounds of the living world always resume after even the longest interruption. The survivors included the crocodilians, those ancient and adaptive reptiles whose deep calls had been a constant element of the Mesozoic soundscape since before the first dinosaur walked the earth. They endured the impact winter in rivers and swamps, their metabolisms slowed to the minimum required for survival, their food requirements reduced to a fraction of what they needed in the warm, productive world that had just ended. Patient beyond human capacity to imagine patience, waiting in the cold dark for a world that would eventually become habitable again. The crocodilians are with us still, producing their deep infrasonic vibrations in the swamps of the world's warm regions, communicating in the same frequencies and through the same mechanisms that their ancestors used in the Mesozoic world. When you hear an alligator call, you are hearing a sound that has been part of the Earth's acoustic environment for more than 200 million years. The birds survived too, or enough of them survived. The avian dinosaurs that had been diversifying through the Cretaceous found their numbers catastrophically reduced by the impact and its aftermath, but the lineages that gave rise to the modern birds endured, and from those lineages, in the long recovery period of the early Paleocene, came the enormous diversification of bird species that eventually produced the world's current acoustic richness. The dawn chorus that greets each morning in any temperate woodland, that extraordinary collective outpouring of territorial and mating songs, is the continuation of a tradition of dinosaur sound that began in the Jurassic forests, and that has never stopped, not even for the impact, not even for the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. The small mammals also survived. They had been living in the margins of the Mesozoic world for more than 100 million years, small and nocturnal and mostly silent, their acoustic contributions to the soundscape minimal compared to the dominant creatures of their era. But the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs removed the dominant competitors and the dominant predators and the dominant shapers of the ecological landscape all at once, and into the ecological space thus vacated, the mammals diversified with an explosive creativity that has no close parallel in the history of life. Within 10 million years of the impact, the mammals had expanded from a handful of small nocturnal insectivores into the ecological equivalents of most of the roles that the dinosaurs had previously occupied. And with that diversification came new sounds, new registers, new modes of acoustic communication. The whales, which descended from small terrestrial mammals that returned to the sea in the early Eocene, would eventually develop the most complex long-distance acoustic communication system that any animal has ever produced, with songs that carry across entire ocean basins in the low-frequency channels of the deep sea, songs of such complexity that they have been the subject of serious analysis for decades without being fully decoded. The elephants would rediscover infrasonic communication in the open savannas, using it to coordinate the movements of family groups across the same kinds of distances and through the same kinds of dense vegetation that the large dinosaurs had navigated by similar means 60 million years earlier. The continuity is real. It is not metaphorical or approximate. The physics of low-frequency communication are the same now as they were in the Cretaceous, and the animals that use low-frequency communication now are using it for the same reasons that the animals of the Cretaceous used it, because it works, because it carries information over long distances through dense media, because it does not give away the caller's precise location to predators the way high-frequency sounds do, because the receiving bodies respond to it with calm rather than alarm. The acoustic ecology of the world has changed enormously in 66 million years, but the acoustic physics have not changed at all, and the bodies that move through the acoustic world respond to it in ways that are shaped by the same evolutionary history that shaped everything else. The recovery of the world's soundscape after the end Cretaceous extinction is a story that unfolded over millions of years, but it is possible to follow its broad outlines through the fossil record and through the comparative biology of the surviving lineages. The early Paleocene was acoustically impoverished compared to the Cretaceous, a world with fewer species and fewer ecological roles and fewer acoustic niches, a world that was rebuilding itself from the survivors of the catastrophe with a kind of slow, inexorable biological creativity. Gradually new species appeared and diversified. New calls filled the empty acoustic spaces. New birds evolved new songs. New mammals developed new modes of vocalization. The world's music composed itself again, movement by movement, instrument by instrument, until the soundscape of the late Eocene and earlier Lycocene was once more as rich and complex as anything the Mesozoic had produced. The non-avian dinosaurs are gone, their particular voices are gone with them, dissolved into the 66 million years of silence that followed the impact at the specific frequencies and in the specific patterns that those specific bodies produced. No living thing will ever produce exactly those sounds again. The crest of Parasaurolophus, the resonating chambers of Tyrannosaurus, the infrasonic broadcast of the sauropod herds, those particular instruments are lost. We can model them. We can estimate them. We can approach them in the imagination with the help of careful science and rigorous reasoning, and that is what this story has tried to do. But we cannot hear them directly. That particular chapter of the Earth's acoustic history is closed. But the night is not closed. The night goes on as it has always gone on, filled now with different sounds in different patterns, but serving the same functions it has always served, providing the conditions for rest and repair, and the quiet transactions of sleep that keep living things alive. The night that you're in right now, wherever you are and whatever sounds surround you, is continuous with the Cretaceous night, linked to it by the unbroken chain of nights that stretches back through geological time to the first night that any animal ever slept through. Every night is a chapter in the same ancient story. The hadrosaurs that called to each other on the floodplain 75 million years ago are gone, but the function that their calling served, the maintenance of the social bond through sound, the acoustic confirmation of presence and safety, the low-frequency permission to rest, that function is still being served, in different animals by different mechanisms, in the living acoustic world that the survivors of the impact rebuilt. And in the particular way that evolutionary continuity works, those functions are being served in you too, in the deep structures of your nervous system that were shaped by the same selective pressures that shape the nervous systems of every nocturnal animal that has ever lived, by the same ancient need for the night to be a safe place, a place where the sounds that surround you carry the information that nothing is alarmed and nothing needs to be done. There is a kind of comfort in this that is not ordinary comfort. It is not the comfort of being told that everything will be fine, which is a human promise and therefore uncertain. It is the comfort of understanding your position in something much larger than yourself, of recognizing that you are not a fragile individual confronting an indifferent universe, but a member of the most resilient lineage that the universe has yet produced, an organism that carries within its body the accumulated intelligence of 4 billion years of life finding its way through every obstacle the cosmos has placed in its path. Your nervous system knows how to sleep. It has been learning how to sleep for an unimaginably long time. All you need to do is give it the conditions it is asking for, and this night, this quiet, the slow recession of the day's concerns into the dark, these are exactly those conditions. You are, in the end, listening to the same night that the dinosaurs listened to. You're inside the same basic acoustic experience that every animal with ears has had since ears evolved. The specific sounds are different. The specific animals are different. But the function is identical, and the feeling, the deep old feeling of being held by the night in a world that is proceeding normally and does not require anything of you, that feeling has not changed at all in 400 million years of nervous systems responding to the sounds of the dark. The survivors of the extinction event that ended the Cretaceous carried with them, in their bodies and in the biological memory of their lineages, the acoustic ecology of the world that had just ended. The Crocodilians carried it in their infrasonic calls, in the precise frequencies that their ancestors had used in the Mesozoic swamps. The birds carried it in their syrinxes, in the neural architecture for complex vocalization that the theropod lineage had developed over millions of years of Mesozoic nights. The mammals carried it in the sensitivity of their auditory systems to the frequencies that the dominant animals of the Mesozoic had used, in the deep somatic response to low-frequency vibration that the small Cretaceous mammals had developed over their 100 million years of living alongside the great dinosaurs. These are not losses from the extinction event. These are inheritances. They are the acoustic legacy of the Mesozoic world, preserved in the bodies of the survivors and carried forward into a new world that was different in every visible way, but that was, acoustically, still listening for the same things that the Mesozoic world had always listened for. The night you are in right now, whatever night it is part of this unbroken chain, It is linked to the Cretaceous night not just metaphorically, but biologically, through the evolutionary history of every organism currently alive in the world and through the physical continuity of the planet itself, which has been spinning through its days and nights without interruption since long before the first dinosaur walked its surface, and will be spinning still long after the last human being who hears this story has returned to the elements. The night is patient in a way that is genuinely difficult for any individual consciousness to fully comprehend. Patient in the way that stone is patient, patient in the way that water is patient, patient in the way that the orbit of a planet around its star is patient, which is to say, it does not experience impatience, it simply continues, and its continuation is the most reliable thing that exists. 66 million years of nights, every one of them containing living things that were sleeping, every one of them producing the sounds of the living world at rest, every one of them doing the same work that this night is doing, holding the sleeping world in the dark, providing the conditions for rest and repair, maintaining the biological rhythms that make life possible. 66 million years, 4.5 billion years, if you count all the nights since the planet formed, and the first tentative chemistry that would eventually become life began its long work in the warm shallow seas. Every one of those nights was a night. This night is a night. And what the night does, what it has always done, what it will always do is receive the sleeping world with perfect patience, hold it in the dark for exactly as long as it needs, and return it to the light. There is a window into the prehistoric acoustic world that is available to you not through any laboratory or museum or digital reconstruction, but through the simple act of going outside on a warm night and being very still and listening carefully to what the world around you is saying. The prehistoric night is not entirely gone. It is present in the living world in ways that are subtle enough to miss if you are moving quickly or distracted, but are unmistakable if you give them your attention. Begin with the birds. The bird that calls in the pre-dawn darkness is a dinosaur. This is not a metaphor or a loose evolutionary claim. In the precise technical language of cladistics, birds are theropod dinosaurs, members of the same evolutionary branch that contained Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor. The lineage that survived the end Cretaceous extinction and diversified into the 10,000 or more species that share the world with us today. When a bird calls in the dark, the biology that produces that call is dinosaurian biology. The syrinx that shapes the sound is a structure that was present in some form in the non-avian theropods. The neural processing that analyzes the incoming call and constructs a response is neural processing that shares its deep architecture with the neural processing of the prehistoric predators and their prey. The nightjar, or goatsucker, is a family of birds found on every continent except Antarctica, and they are among the most evocative acoustic presences of the warm night world. They call in the deep of the night, not in the dawn chorus, but in the hours when most other birds are silent. Their calls are extraordinary, sustained churring sounds that last for minutes at a time, produced by a specialized technique of controlled vibration, sounds that in their persistence and their particular quality evoke something older than birdsong, something that occupies the same psychological space as the sound of distant water or wind in tall trees. The nightjar sitting in a dark tree producing its remarkable sustained call is participating in the same acoustic world that the small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous participated in, the world of nighttime sound production for social communication in the dark. If you have ever lain awake in the country on a summer night and heard the churring of a nightjar carrying through the darkness, you have had a direct acoustic experience that connects you to the Cretaceous world. Not as a metaphor, not as a loose association. The nightjar's vocal apparatus, its behavioral context, the function of its call in the ecology of the nighttime landscape, all of these have counterparts in the Mesozoic. The call that reached your ears on that summer night was produced by a body that is, in deep biological terms, a modified theropod dinosaur, and the experience of lying in the dark and hearing it is not so different from the experience of any small mammal that lay in a Cretaceous forest and heard the calls of the small feathered theropods in the branches above. The alligator is a more direct connection still. Modern alligators produce infrasonic vibrations by the water dancing method, and when they bellow in the breeding season, the low resonant sounds they produce are, in their frequency content and their carrying capacity, comparable to what researchers believe the large dinosaurs produced. An alligator bellowing in a Florida swamp in the early morning is producing a sound that has relatives in the Mesozoic, a sound produced by a body plan that has changed remarkably little in 200 million years, in an acoustic environment that is, in its broad features, recognizable as the same kind of environment that surrounded the earliest dinosaurs. There is a specific behavior that American alligators display in warm weather, particularly in the breeding season, that represents perhaps the most direct acoustic window into the Mesozoic world that any living animal provides. They submerge themselves to neck depth and then produce very low-frequency infrasonic vibrations that cause the water above their backs to dance in the characteristic pattern called the water dance, where droplets jump up from the surface in a circle around the animal as if the water itself is vibrating. These vibrations travel through the water and through the ground simultaneously, and they carry to other alligators across distances that the accompanying audible bellows could not reach. An alligator producing this behavior in a Florida swamp is using the same basic acoustic mechanism, infrasound transmitted through water and ground simultaneously, that researchers believe the large dinosaurs used in the warm, shallow waters and muddy riverbanks of the Cretaceous. The cassowary, that large and formidable flightless bird of the Australian and New Guinea rainforests, produces a call so low in frequency and so powerful in output that it may, in some frequencies, be infrasonic. The cassowary is, among living birds, perhaps the most physically imposing reminder that the line between bird and non-avian dinosaur is a legal and phylogenetic distinction, rather than an obvious physical one. Standing nearly 2 meters tall, with a bony casque on its head and claws that can inflict serious injury, and producing deep resonant calls from within a body that is structured more like a small theropod than like any bird in the popular imagination, the cassowary sounds in the green dark of the rainforest genuinely prehistoric. There have been a small number of people who have had the experience of hearing a cassowary call in the rainforest at night, and their descriptions share certain qualities, regardless of their individual backgrounds or expectations. They describe a sound that is felt before it is heard. They describe a sound that is difficult to place, to assign a direction and a distance to, in the way that infrasound is always difficult to place because it arrives from multiple paths simultaneously. They describe a quality of the sound that produces not fear, despite the fearsome reputation of the animal, but a kind of stillness, an involuntary stopping of movement and conversation and thought, a pulling of attention inward and downward, toward the body rather than outward toward the environment. This is the effect that infrasound reliably produces in the primate nervous system, and it is presumably related to the effect that the infrasonic calls of the large dinosaurs produced in the nervous systems of every animal that lived alongside them in the Mesozoic world. Even the domestic rooster, crowing in the first light of dawn, is producing a sound that is, in its deep evolutionary history, continuous with the sounds that the Cretaceous forests filled with as the early birds diversified. The rooster's crow is one of the most ancient sounds in human experience, present at the edge of every human settlement since the domestication of the chicken, always associated with dawn, always carrying that particular quality of announcement and renewal that early morning birdsong has carried since long before any human was there to hear it. It is a thoroughly modern sound, and it is, simultaneously, a sound with roots that extend all the way back to the acoustic world of the Mesozoic. The ecological and acoustic role of birdsong in the modern world is enormous, and its connection to the Mesozoic soundscape is not merely historical. The dawn chorus, that extraordinary collective outpouring of territorial and mating songs that erupts each morning in any temperate woodland at the moment when light becomes sufficient to activate the singing impulse, is one of the most complex acoustic events that the natural world produces on a daily basis. Hundreds of species, each with its own distinct vocal signature, its own specific timing within the collective performance, its own particular contribution to the overall acoustic structure of the dawn, coming together in an unrepeatable, non-conducted performance that is simultaneously an ecological event, a social event, and one of the most reliably mood-altering natural acoustic phenomena that human beings regularly encounter. For those who want to hear the closest living approximation to the acoustic world of the prehistoric night, the wetlands and swamps and slow rivers of the warm regions of the world offer the richest experience. A night spent near a subtropical wetland, listening to the frog calls and the insect chorus and the occasional alligator bellow and the calls of wading birds and the distant sound of large water birds moving across the water, is a night spent in a soundscape that, in its basic structure, would not have been entirely foreign to the ears of a hadrosaur drinking at a Cretaceous river bend. The same could be said, in a reduced and more attenuated form, of almost any warm night in almost any landscape with adequate moisture and vegetation. The ancient chorus has been interrupted and fragmented by human alteration of the environment. The particular animals that fill the nighttime acoustic register have changed, but the register itself remains, and the relationship between the living world and the night remains, and the sounds that most reliably guide the human nervous system toward a rest are the same sounds that guided the nervous systems of the animals of the Mesozoic toward rest, because the relationship between the brain and these sounds is older than the Mesozoic, older than the dinosaurs, as old as the first nervous system that learned to distinguish the sounds that meant safety from the sounds that meant danger. Modern research into the psychophysiology of sound and sleep has confirmed what ancient nervous systems have always known. The sounds that promote sleep are characteristically broadband, continuous, and moderate in amplitude. They mask the sharp, discrete sounds that trigger the orienting reflex, the automatic response of the nervous system to sounds that might signal something requiring attention. Rain does this, wind in leaves does this, the sound of a river or an ocean does this, the insect chorus of a warm summer night does this. All of these sounds are versions of the same fundamental acoustic template, the template of the world proceeding without alarm, the template of the ancient night that said to every nervous system that evolved within it, "You are safe, you can rest, the night is what it always is." There is a particular quality of night sound that functions, for almost every person who pays attention to it, as a reliable invitation to sleep. It is characterized by a few consistent features. It is continuous rather than intermittent. It occupies the lower and middle frequency ranges. It comes from multiple sources simultaneously, rather than from a single focused point, and it carries no information that requires response, no alarm note, no signal of distress, no pattern of sharp and sudden change that the vigilant brain cannot help but analyze and assess. The sound of rain, the sound of wind in leaves, the sound of distant water, the sound of an insect chorus on a warm night. These are all variations on the same theme, the theme of the world doing what it does when it is not being disturbed, the theme of the ancient night proceeding as it should. And somewhere within that theme, if you are still enough to hear it, there is something older still. The echo of a Parasaurolophus call drifting across a Cretaceous floodplain, the low infrasonic pulse of a sauropod herd in a Jurassic forest, the closed-mouth rumble of a mother dinosaur settling over her nest. These sounds are not literally present in the world around you, but their logic is present, their function is present, the evolutionary relationship between those sounds and the sleeping animal is present, written into your body in the same indelible way that the night is written into your body, as a necessity, as a gift, as the oldest and most reliable thing in the world. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. The sounds around you right now, whatever they are, whatever combination of the modern world's acoustic texture is present in the room or the space where you are, they are part of the same unbroken chain. Your nervous system is not new. Your nervous system is ancient, inherited from the long line of animals that lived through the Mesozoic and beyond, animals that slept in the ancient night and woke to the ancient morning and that gave to you, across the vast distance of evolutionary time, the capacity to do the same. The prehistoric night is inside you as much as it is outside. It is the rhythm of your breathing, it is the slowing of your thoughts, it is the weight of your body against whatever holds it up, gravity doing what gravity has always done, holding every living thing close to the surface of the earth where it belongs. Listen for it. You will not hear the dinosaurs, but you might hear something that has been singing their song since before they were born and is singing it still, in every living thing that calls in the dark, in every frequency that carries across a warm night without alarm. The prehistoric soundscape is not gone. It has simply changed performers. The music continues, the night continues, and you, here, now, in the dark, at the edge of sleep, are part of it. There is a practice that some people find helpful when they want to reconnect with the ancient acoustic world that this story has described, and it requires nothing more than a warm night, a quiet outdoor space, and the willingness to lie still for an extended period with the eyes closed. Simply lie down, preferably on the actual ground rather than on a chair or a bench, with your back against the earth and your eyes toward the sky if the night is clear, and be still and listen. Not listen for anything in particular. Not listen with the analytical attention that is looking for identifiable sounds and categorizing them. Listen the way a body listens when it is relaxed, and not trying to listen, the way sound reaches you when you're not reaching toward it. What you will find, if you give it enough time, is a gradual deepening of the acoustic landscape, a revelation of layers that were there all along, but that the active, analytical attention was preventing you from receiving. The ground beneath you will eventually begin to reveal its vibrations, the minute structural sounds of the earth conducting the movements of distant things. The air will reveal its depth, the way sounds at different distances and different frequencies arrive at slightly different times and from slightly different directions, and the insect chorus, if one is present, will stop being a background and start being a texture, a complex and beautiful and ancient texture that the body receives not as noise but as company. This practice, lying on the ground in the dark and listening, is not a new invention. Every human culture that has ever lived close to the natural world has some version of it, some practice of deliberate immersion in the acoustic environment of the night, some recognition that the sounds of the living world at night have a particular power to restore and calm and orient the person who receives them with full attention. The particular cultures and the particular practices vary. The underlying experience does not. It is the experience of a mammalian nervous system making contact with the acoustic environment that shaped it, recognizing in the sounds of the living night the sounds that have been telling mammalian bodies for 100 million years that the world is safe and the night is as it should be, and sleep is not only possible but invited. One final observation about the relationship between the prehistoric acoustic world and the world you inhabit. The sounds that surround you right now, whatever they are, wherever you are, they are not random. They are the product of the same evolutionary processes that produced the sounds of the Mesozoic night, acting on different animals in different environments over the 66 million years since the extinction event that ended that world. Every sound in your current environment that is not produced by human technology is part of the continuing evolution of the natural acoustic world, shaped by the same selective pressures that shape the calls of the Hadrosaurs and the Crocodilians and the small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous forest. The sparrow outside your window is a theropod dinosaur. The frog in any nearby water is the descendant of the frogs that cooled in the Cretaceous ponds. The cricket in any grass is the descendant of the crickets that sang in the Jurassic night. All of them are here, all of them are making their calls, and all of those calls are, in the most fundamental biological sense, part of the same story that this night has been telling you since its beginning. Come back one more time, one final time. The night is waiting for you. The same night, the warm dark of the deep Cretaceous, and it is patient in the way that 75 million years of accumulated patience produces, with no urgency and no expectation, and nothing but the quiet fact of its existence, which is all the invitation you have ever needed. You are at the edge of the Hadrosaur floodplain, the same one from the beginning of this story, and the night is in its deepest phase, the hour between midnight and the first suggestion of dawn when the world is most completely itself, when the masks of activity and alertness have been put away, and what remains is the fundamental texture of living things at rest, in a world that is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The journey that brought you here, through the debates of paleontology and the evidence of living relatives, and the reconstruction of ancient soundscapes from the fragments that time has preserved, that journey has ended. There is nothing left to learn tonight, nothing left to understand. The mind has done its work, and now it is the body's turn, and the body only needs the things that it has always needed at this hour: darkness, stillness, warmth, the low background sound of a world that is not alarmed, and permission to let go. The Hadrosaur herd is quiet now. The earlier evening chorus of contact calls has subsided into the occasional low murmur, the sleep sounds of the large and settled herd, bodies touching or nearly touching in the way of social animals seeking the warmth and security of proximity. The sound they make collectively is less a series of distinct calls than a general low vibration, the massed breathing of hundreds of large bodies producing a continuous, barely audible presence in the air, like the sound a forest makes when many leaves are moving very slightly in a wind too gentle to be felt. The stars above the floodplain are at their peak brilliance, the sky having reached the maximum darkness possible in a world without artificial light, and the Milky Way is a river of genuine light overhead. Not the faint smear of the light-polluted sky of your own time, but something that casts a faint shadow if you hold your hand above your face. The light from stars that are not yet born and stars that have already died, travelling toward this moment across distances so large that the mind cannot hold them, arriving here, now, to lay its pale silver wash across the Cretaceous floodplain and the sleeping herd and the dark mirror of the river beyond. Nothing moves in any purposeful way. The river moves, because rivers always move, but without intention. A few leaves drift down from the trees at the forest edge, riding the faint air movement that the cooling night has produced near the surface of the water. The crocodilian on its sandbar is so still that it has become part of the geography of the river, an extension of the land rather than a creature on it. The pterosaurs high in the canopy are folded into themselves, reducing their metabolic overhead to the minimum required to maintain the systems that keep them alive. The air on your skin is warm and carries the smell of the floodplain, the mineral richness of wet soil, the sweetness of plant matter in various stages of growth and decay, the faint ozone-like sharpness of the river, where it moves over exposed stone in the shallows, the barely perceptible warmth of many large bodies nearby. These are not smells that require any analysis. They do not ask anything of you. They are simply part of the texture of this particular place at this particular hour, part of the accumulated sensory information that the body receives and processes below the level of consciousness, adding to the picture that the nervous system is continuously building of the state of the world, and whether that state requires a response. The answer at this hour in this place is clear. No response is needed. The world is as it should be. A single Parasaurolophus, an adult female near the centre of the herd, produces a call so low and so slow that it takes several seconds to rise and several seconds to fall. It is not, at this hour, a directed message. It is closer to what the low vocalizations of sleeping elephants are. A self-produced sound that confirms the presence of the self to itself. A way of being acoustically present in the world without fully waking. A sound that comes from the body the way warmth comes from the body, as a byproduct of the processes of life rather than as a deliberate act. The call moves across the floodplain at the speed of sound in warm, humid air, slower than you might expect, shaping itself around the contours of the landscape, bending slightly where the forest edge creates a barrier, spreading across the open water of the river with less attenuation than it would experience over dry land, travelling eventually into distances where it can no longer be heard, even by ears much more sensitive than yours. It dissolves into the night the way everything dissolves into the night at this hour, gradually, without resistance, without any particular event to mark its ending, simply becoming quieter and quieter, until it is indistinguishable from the background sound of the world. The background sound of the world. That is what you're listening to now. Not any particular sound, not any particular voice or call or vibration, but the sum of all of them. The accumulated acoustic output of an entire landscape alive and at rest. The ancient chorus in its night form, lowered in volume and altered in character from the peak hours, but still present, still layered, still maintaining the relationship between living things and the night that has been maintained without interruption since the first living thing learned to be quiet in the dark. You have travelled, in this story, across 150 million years of geological time, from the ancient Jurassic forest to the Hadrosaur floodplains of the Late Cretaceous, from the infrasonic calls of sauropods to the intimate vocalizations of brooding feathered theropods, from the scientific debate about what dinosaurs sounded like to the living descendants that carry the acoustic inheritance of the Mesozoic world into our own time. You have travelled far, and you have arrived here at this particular moment, which is the deepest moment of the night, the moment when travel ends and rest begins. You are breathing more slowly than you were an hour ago. You may have noticed this, or you may not have. The breath has slowed without any instruction, the way breathing always slows when the body is moving toward rest, the respiratory rate following the lead of the calming nervous system, in and out, each breath slightly slower and slightly deeper than the one before it, the body doing what it knows how to do, performing the ancient transition from wakefulness to sleep with the particular effortless grace that comes from practicing something for 70 million years of evolutionary history. The muscles in your face are soft. The muscles in your hands are soft. the held patterns of the day, the accumulated tensions of concentration and response, and the subtle physical reflections of the mind's movements through its hours of activity. Those patterns are releasing slowly and completely, the way a fist opens when the hand is truly relaxed. Not forced open, but simply allowed to be open. The default state of a hand that is not required to hold anything. The night holds you instead. The warm Cretaceous air, the weight of the darkness, the low vibration in the ground, the distant breathing of the enormous herd, the river making its quiet, patient sound somewhere beyond the trees. All of it holding you, all of it saying, in the language that the world has always used to speak to sleeping things, in the language of low sound and warmth and the absence of anything sharp or sudden or requiring response, that you are safe here, that the night is what it should be, that everything that needs to be done is done. There is a particular kind of safety that only the very old can provide. Human beings are old, as species go, a few 100,000 years of our particular form. Mammals are older, somewhere around 200 million years. The ancestors of the Crocodilians are older still, over 250 million years. The night is older than all of them, as old as the planet itself, as old as the relationship between the surface of the Earth and the star that warms it. The relationship that produces, every 24 hours, this particular gift. The slow rotation of the hemisphere away from the sun, the cooling of the air, the darkness that gathers in the east and moves westward, the permission that the night gives to every living thing to stop. The last call of the night comes from somewhere you cannot precisely locate. A single long low note, rising very slowly from below the edge of hearing to just above it, holding for a moment at the peak, and then descending again, as slowly as it came, back into the infrasonic depths from which it emerged. The call of a Parasaurolophus, perhaps, speaking to no one in particular, speaking to the night itself, speaking in the way that all living things speak when they have nothing particular to say except that they are here, they are alive, the world is good, the night is good, and sleep is coming. Sleep is coming for you too. It has been coming since the first paragraph of this story, moving toward you with the same patient inevitability with which the night moves toward the sleeping world, and it is very close now, as close as the next breath, as close as the next beat of the slow and steadying heart. The prehistoric night is doing what it has always done. The ancient music is playing, the world is old and patient and full of a beauty so deep that it requires no witnesses and makes no demands. You are here. You are warm. The night is all around you, as it has been all around every living thing that has ever drawn breath and closed its eyes. From the first Cretaceous night when a small feathered animal tucked its head beneath its wing in the branches of a conifer that no longer exists, to this night, your night, the night you are in right now. The Cretaceous night and your night are the same night, separated only by time, which is the most patient thing that exists. The world breathes and breathes and breathes, and in the next breath, or the one after that, you will stop counting them, and the night will receive you, as it has always received everything that has ever given itself to it, completely, gently, without conditions and without end. The thing about the ancient night is that it is not romantic in any way that requires sentimentality. It does not offer comfort because it is beautiful, though it is beautiful. It does not offer rest because it is peaceful, though it is peaceful. It offers these things because it is simply what it is, the dark half of the Earth's daily cycle, the biological necessity of the night, the condition under which every living thing that has ever lived eventually must close its eyes and stop. There is no philosophy required for this. There is no understanding required for this. There is only the body and the dark and the ancient fact of sleep, which has been the most reliable thing in the world since before the first eye opened to perceive it. You are very close now. The thoughts that move through the mind have that particular quality of late-night thoughts. Thoughts that arrive without much force and depart without much insistence. Thoughts that do not attach themselves to you or demand your engagement. Thoughts that are passing through rather than settling in. This is the natural state of a mind that is approaching sleep, and it requires nothing from you except the willingness to not pursue the thoughts that are passing, to let them come and let them go, to be the space through which they pass rather than the person who has to do something about them. The ancient night holds that space, the ancient sounds fill it, and in that space, between one thought and the next, between one breath and the next, between one moment of awareness and the next, sleep is waiting with the patience of something that has been waiting since the beginning of the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And now only this. The breathing of the world in the dark, in, out, in, out. The low, slow rhythm of enormous bodies at rest on a warm floodplain 75 million years ago, their calls subsided, their movements stilled, their enormous metabolisms turning slowly in the night like millstones grinding the hours into morning. You are breathing with them. The stars are turning, the river is moving, the insect song continues its ancient unbroken thread, the same song it has been singing since before the first dinosaur walked the earth, the same song it will be singing long after the last one is gone. You are inside the song. You have always been inside the song. Let the night be large. Let your body be small and warm and held by the darkness in the way that all small warm things have always been held by darkness, without ceremony, without announcement, without any requirement of anything from you at all. The Hadrosaur herd breathes. The river moves. The stars turn. The ancient world is doing what it does, as it has always done, as it will always do, with no reference to your wakefulness and no need of your attention. You can go now. The night will be here when you return. Breathe in. Breathe out. Sleep. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to hear next, a prehistoric creature, a lost world, a mystery from deep time, please leave it in the comments. The ancient dark has many more stories in it, and I will be here to tell them.